There is a moment in September of 1942 when the Atlantic Ocean, vast and indifferent, becomes a threshold. On one side of it lies the ordinary course of war, on the other, an incident so morally tangled that it would reshape how nations treated the drowning at sea for decades to come. But in that particular September night, no one aboard the RMS Laconia could have known they were sailing toward the pivot point of their own history, let alone the history of naval warfare itself. Picture, if you will, the slow heave of the mid-Atlantic in darkness. The water is cool now as autumn approaches, and its surface moves in long, patient swells that rise and fall with a rhythm older than any war. Somewhere above, clouds obscure the stars. The sky and sea have become one grey-black expanse, a world without horizon, without edge. It is the kind of darkness that has weight to it, that settles on a ship like a held breath. The Laconia cuts through these waters with a steady, mechanical pulse. She is a British ocean liner, requisitioned from the Cunard White Star Line, her peacetime glamour long since stripped away and replaced with the drab utility of wartime service. Her engines, once tuned to carry wealthy passengers across the Atlantic in comfort, now labor under the burden of nearly 3,000 souls. Below her decks, in spaces designed for a fraction of that number, soldiers rest uneasily. Italian prisoners of war, captured in North Africa, are packed into holds that smell of diesel and sweat and the accumulated unease of men who have already lost once. There are families too, civilians being evacuated from the theatre of war, their fates entrusted to the speed and luck of a single ship crossing an ocean that has become a hunting ground. The engines throb with a sound that is both mechanical and alive, a sound that travels through the hull and into the bones of every person aboard. It is a comforting sound in some ways, the assurance of motion, of progress toward safety. But there is something else in that engine sound too, something that experienced sailors recognize with a dull certainty. The Laconia is making noise, a lot of noise, and in the Atlantic of 1942, noise is a kind of confession. Above the deck, the sea stretches endlessly in all directions, and somewhere in that darkness, beyond the reach of sight or sound, other machines are listening, submarines. U-boats. The predators of these waters have become as much a part of the Atlantic landscape as the currents and the storms. They hunt by stealth and silence, and a ship as loud as the Laconia, moving as steadily as the Laconia, might as well be ringing a bell and calling out to anyone within range. The crew moves through their routines with the practiced efficiency of men accustomed to danger, but there is a kind of dread in that efficiency too, a tension that lives just beneath the surface of duty. How many ships have been sunk in the past year alone? How many convoys have been scattered and destroyed? The numbers are staggering, and every sailor aboard knows them in the way that people know statistics that could apply to themselves at any moment. The Laconia's captain maintains his watch, his eyes scanning the darkness, and in that endless dark there is a question that cannot be asked aloud, but is understood by everyone aboard. Are we already marked? Has a periscope already found us in the night? Is somewhere down there, in the cold, deep Atlantic, a captain in a steel tube already lining us up in his crosshairs? These are the hours before the world changes, before a single moment of violence begins a cascade of consequences that will echo through military law and maritime history and the very understanding of what mercy means in a time of war. But for now, the Laconia moves through the dark water with her human cargo, her engines creating a steady, relentless sound, and the night is long and the ocean is patient. If you find yourself drawn to the hidden architecture of these pivotal historical moments, the small, precise intersections where individual choices remake the rules by which entire nations will fight, then please subscribe to this channel. We explore these stories of the Second World War with the depth and care they deserve, stories like the Laconia Order that reveal something true about how wars are fought and how wars change us. For now, the ship moves on, the water heaves, the engines pulse with their mechanical certainty, and somewhere in the darkness, in a way that no one aboard the Laconia can yet perceive. History is moving toward them, with the inevitability of a submarine closing the distance through the deep. The ship that would carry all of this forward through history was, in her peacetime years, simply a vessel of grace. The RMS Laconia, built in 1911 and registered in Liverpool, had spent 3 decades crossing the Atlantic with the steady rhythm of a metronome, ferrying passengers who watched sunsets from her promenade decks and dined beneath electric chandeliers while an orchestra played in the background. She was 19,000 tons of pressed steel and aspiration, built in an age when ocean liners still represented the pinnacle of human engineering and comfort, before the war unraveled so many certainties. By September of 1942, the Laconia had become something altogether different. Requisitioned by the British government as the fighting spread and resources dwindled, she had been stripped of her finery and converted into a troopship. The elegant staterooms where wealthy travellers once slept had been subdivided and crowded with military bunks. The dining halls where conversation once flowed over white tablecloths now served as hold spaces for equipment and supplies. She was no longer a symbol of peace and commerce, but rather a tool of war, part of the grinding machinery of conflict that consumed vessels and lives with equal indifference. On this particular voyage, which would begin in early September, the Laconia carried approximately 2,000 souls, soldiers heading toward theatre, civilian crew members, and below decks, pressed into the hold in cramped conditions that those who survived would later describe as almost unbearable, were more than 1,800 Italian prisoners of war. Italy had recently switched allegiances in the war, changing sides from the Axis to join with the Allies. Yet the Italian soldiers remained locked away, uncertain of their fate, uncertain even of whether the world above deck knew that their government had reversed course. They were trapped in darkness and confusion, speaking languages that few around them understood, waiting with the particular dread that comes from captivity in wartime. The Laconia was steaming toward a port in North Africa, toward Durban, toward a future that no one aboard could truly predict. And somewhere beneath the waves in those same waters, moving silently through darkness with a purpose of its own, another vessel was traversing the same ocean. Consider for a moment the strange symmetry of it all, how 2 ships, one aging but dignified in her requisition service, the other sleek and purpose-built for destruction, should converge in the same patch of Atlantic water on a single night. The likelihood seems almost too perfectly arranged to be true, and yet that is precisely what occurred. Neither ship knew the other was coming. Neither crew could have anticipated the chain of events that would soon unfold, the choices that would be made in moments of crisis, the consequences that would ripple through the rest of the war and into the peace that followed. What made the Laconia different from so many other ships that were torpedoed during the Atlantic campaign, what made her into something more than simply another entry in casualty lists, was what happened after the torpedoes struck. It was the choices made in the water by a submarine captain who found himself facing a decision that no training, no military doctrine, no clear order had prepared him for. It was the brief, flickering moment when the machinery of war encountered the possibility of mercy and the profound uncertainty about what to do when those 2 forces collided. Ships were being sunk regularly in the Atlantic by this point in the war. The Battle of the Atlantic had been raging for 3 years already, a grinding campaign of attrition where German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes seeking targets, and Allied escorts and aircraft hunted in return. Thousands had died already. The water of the Atlantic, one might say, had become a graveyard where certain rules applied. Cold rules, efficient rules, the rules of survival. When a ship went down, it generally went down, and those who did not make it into lifeboats faced a bitter end in the cold northern waters. But the Laconia would not simply disappear into that routine tragedy. Instead, her sinking would become a moment where the war paused, if only briefly, where individual conscience stood against the demands of command, where a few hours in the dark revealed something about human nature that would be debated and dissected for decades to come. What follows is a story that historians still struggle to fully reconcile, that military ethicists and legal scholars have turned over and over in their minds, looking for the right angles to examine it from. It is a story about orders and their limits, about the difference between following commands and choosing to become complicit in something larger. It is a story about what happens when survival becomes everyone's only concern, when the normal rules break down and people are left to improvise in chaos. In the dark water, in the cold Atlantic night, with the slow, creaking disaster of a sinking ship setting the stage, all of these questions were about to become not academic, but desperately, immediately real. The story we're about to unfold sits at the precise intersection of several currents in human history: the mechanical brutality of industrial war, the spark of mercy in the midst of violence, and the impossible weight of command decisions made in seconds that echo for decades. And if this particular convergence of history, ethics, and the sea speaks to you the way it does to many of us, you might find yourself drawn to other moments like it, other instances where the war in the Atlantic revealed something unexpected about the human capacity for both cruelty and compassion, often contained within the same person, the same submarine, the same impossible night. If stories like this one, deeply researched, carefully constructed, designed not just to inform, but to let you rest while you contemplate the quieter corners of history, are what you're drawn to, consider subscribing so that more of them can find their way to you in the evenings when the day is finally settling behind you. Now, back to September of 1942 and the particular circumstances that would set in motion a cascade of events that military historians still debate with intensity today. The Atlantic at that time was not a place of safety for any vessel, regardless of its flag or its cargo. The waters between Europe and North America had become, over the preceding 3 years, a theater of attrition and shadow, where submarines moved like dark fish through the depths and merchant ships burned like candles against the horizon. The technology was still relatively crude by the standards of what would come later. Radar was improving, but its reliability could not yet be taken for granted, and radio direction finding, while it existed, was far from the omniscient tool it would eventually become. This meant that the ocean in 1942 could still swallow vessels, could still hide entire fleets, and could still permit acts of both heroism and abandonment to occur far from the scrutiny of those who might record them. The RMS Laconia was a British liner of some distinction, built in 1911, and by the time she carried soldiers and prisoners across the Atlantic, she had already lived through considerable history. She was a substantial vessel, over 18,000 tons, with the kinds of comfortable appointments that ocean travel in peacetime afforded to those who could pay for it. But war transforms such ships with remarkable speed and often terrible finality. The Laconia had been requisitioned by the British military, as so many civilian vessels were, and in the early months of 1942 she had been assigned to carry troops, supplies, and something that would prove to be critically important to our story: a substantial number of Italian prisoners of war, men captured in North Africa and now being transported to prisoner camps far from their homeland. Picture, if you will, the particular geography of this moment. The Laconia was somewhere in the vast emptiness between West Africa and the coast of Brazil, a part of the Atlantic that stretches on, with nothing to break the horizon except the occasional ship and, unseen beneath the waves, the submarines that hunted them. This was the domain of the German U-boat fleet, and more specifically, on the night in question, it would be the domain of one submarine in particular, U-156, commanded by a man named Werner Hartenstein, a captain who would soon find himself at the center of one of the war's most morally complex episodes. The decision to include Italian prisoners aboard the Laconia was not unusual for the time. The Italians had been German allies until only recently, and their sudden shift in allegiance had left thousands of their soldiers caught between nations, unsure of their status, uncertain of where safety might lie. They were being transported to camps where they would wait out the remainder of the war in captivity, a fate that, while often harsh, was considerably preferable to combat. But this detail, the presence of these Italian prisoners, would become crucial to understanding what happened next, and to understanding the moral calculus that would drive the decisions made by Capitan Hartenstein in the hours following a single moment of explosive violence in the darkness. The sea itself, on the night of September 11, 1942, was relatively calm, which in some ways made what was about to happen all the more unexpected. The Laconia was not zigzagging, a tactic employed to confound submarine attacks, because she was running independently, without an organized convoy, and the decision had been made that her speed alone would provide sufficient protection. This was sometimes a gamble that succeeded, and sometimes one that cost thousands of lives. On this particular night, the gamble was about to fail spectacularly, and the consequences would ripple outward in ways that no one aboard either the ship or the submarine could have fully anticipated. What is fascinating, when we examine the historical records and the accounts that survived, is the sheer ordinariness of the moment before catastrophe. The crew was going about their routines. Those soldiers not on watch were sleeping, or writing letters, or playing cards, or simply lying in their berths in the darkness, thinking perhaps of home, of families they had left behind, of a war that seemed to have swallowed the entire known world. The Italian prisoners were similarly confined to their quarters, guarded by British soldiers, separated from the main body of the ship, living in conditions that were crowded and uncomfortable, but not inhumane. And somewhere beneath the surface of the ocean, U-156 was moving through the darkness, her crew alert and focused, searching for exactly the kind of target that the Laconia presented. The question that haunts this story, even now, is whether what happened next was inevitable or contingent, whether the collision between these two vessels was written into the fabric of history, or whether it was simply a matter of chance, of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, of a submarine and a ship occupying the same patch of ocean on the same night. We may never know the answer to that question with absolute certainty, but we can know what followed, and we can attempt to understand the moral landscape that those who witnessed it had to navigate. The next section of our journey will take us deeper into the context of this moment, into the broader struggle for the Atlantic itself, and the role that submarines had come to play in the calculus of modern warfare. We'll meet Capitan Hartenstein more fully, and we'll begin to understand the kind of man he was before the Laconia transformed him into a historical figure, a name that scholars still invoke when they discuss the limits of mercy and obedience in times of total war. To understand why a single submarine's decision to rescue drowning men would eventually shake the entire German naval command, we must first drift back a little further to the vast and darkening waters where the U-boat had already begun to reshape the very nature of modern warfare. By the early months of 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had already claimed countless lives across 3 years of relentless undersea conflict. The Atlantic itself, that immense stretch of cold water between the old world and the new, had become something more than geography. It had become an arena, a borderless battlefield where merchant vessels and destroyers moved in fear of the unseen menace beneath the waves. And what was that menace? A single man in a periscope's eyepiece, commanding a vessel no longer than a city block, could determine the fate of hundreds. Consider for a moment the peculiar loneliness of submarine warfare. In the trenches of the Great War, soldiers could see the faces of their enemies. They could hear the screams, smell the earth, feel the concussive force of artillery nearby. But beneath the surface of the ocean, war became something else entirely. A U-boat captain saw nothing but water, instruments, and the blurred outline of a ship through his scope. He heard nothing but the hum of engines and the quiet voices of his crew. The act of sinking a vessel, of sending hundreds of people into the darkness and the cold, happened at a remove that was both physical and psychological. The explosion was silent to those who caused it. The screams never reached the submarine's steel hull, and this was precisely how the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, intended it to be. The U-boat fleet had evolved into something approaching a masterwork of predatory efficiency. These submarines operated on the principle of commerce raiding, a tactic as old as naval warfare itself, but now amplified by engineering and discipline into something far more systematic. Where earlier privateers had attacked merchant shipping under loose rules of engagement, the U-boats of Nazi Germany moved with calculated coordination, guided by Admiralty intelligence and shaped by explicit operational doctrine. They hunted in wolf packs. They coordinated their strikes. They sank not out of passion or desperation, but out of deliberate strategic calculation. The statistics accumulated with a grim arithmetic. By the autumn of 1941, the previous year, the Allies had lost over 1 million tons of merchant shipping to German U-boats. Entire convoys had vanished beneath the waves. The supplies that were meant to reach Britain, the food, the ammunition, the fuel, the machinery of survival, often never arrived, and the men aboard those ships, the merchant mariners and the naval escorts, paid with their lives. Some died in the immediate violence of the sinking. Others, drifting in lifeboats or clinging to wreckage, died slowly in the cold embrace of the Atlantic. What might you imagine occupied the minds of these drowning men in those final moments? Were they thinking of home, of their families, of the strange injustice that their deaths, though they were civilians conducting commerce in their own occupation, were somehow considered acceptable losses in the machinery of total war? And yet, from a strategic perspective, the perspective of the Kriegsmarine's leadership in distant Berlin, these losses served a purpose. The U-boat campaign was designed to starve Britain, to cut the island nation off from its lifelines of supply, to reduce it slowly through attrition until it could no longer continue the fight. It was a campaign of patience and mathematics. Every sinking reduced the enemy's capacity to resist. Every merchant vessel claimed was one less ship carrying supplies, one less contribution to the enemy's war effort. In the cold calculus of naval strategy, the lives of the men aboard were almost secondary to the arithmetic of tonnage. But how does a strategic necessity sit with the human conscience? How does the killing of drowning men, men who might be non-combatants, might be innocent civilians merely doing their job, fit within any moral framework, even the framework of a nation at war? These questions, though they might have seemed abstract in the early days of the U-boat campaign, would eventually become terribly concrete, and they would find their most acute expression in the story of a single ship, a single U-boat captain, and the order that would follow. The U-boats themselves, the submarines that carried out these attacks, were marvels of military engineering. The Type Vic, the most common German submarine of the war, displaced about 770 tons on the surface and perhaps 860 when submerged. It was cramped, claustrophobic, filled with the intricate machinery of compressed air and electric power. A crew of about 45 men lived and worked in these steel tubes for weeks at a time, rarely seeing daylight, breathing air that grew progressively staler and more foul as days passed. The men who served on U-boats were selected for specific qualities: courage, yes, but also a certain mechanical aptitude, a calm under pressure, and perhaps most importantly, an ability to function in extreme discomfort and danger. These crews were, in the main, professionals. They were not fanatics or sadists. They were sailors doing a job, serving their nation as they understood it. And among them were officers and captains of genuine ability, men who commanded respect both within their crews and even, eventually, among their enemies. These were men of the sea, inheritors of a long tradition of German naval excellence. But what changed, and what we must understand before we can grasp the full weight of what happened in September of 1942, was the nature of the command structure that guided these men. The U-boat arm of the German Navy, known as the Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, or the commander of U-boats, would eventually be headed by a man named Karl Dönitz. Dönitz was not simply a naval officer. He was an architect of a new form of naval warfare. He was a believer in the U-boat as the weapon that would win the Atlantic, that would starve Britain, that would secure German victory. And as the months and years of the war wore on, as the losses mounted on both sides, as the stakes grew ever higher and the conflict deepened into something more totalizing, Dönitz's conception of the U-boat campaign would become harder, more ruthless, more uncompromising. The question of what was permissible in warfare would become not a question for philosophers or ethicists, but a question for operational commanders who had to decide, in real time, how their men would conduct themselves at sea. The ocean, vast and indifferent, would soon become the stage for one of the starkest illustrations of this transformation. The man who commanded U-156 in those fateful waters was Captain Werner Hartenstein, a figure who would come to embody the terrible paradox at the heart of the Laconia story, a professional naval officer caught between the iron protocols of war and the unquiet stirrings of human conscience. Born in 1908, Hartenstein belonged to that generation of German submariners who had grown up in the Navy's traditions, who understood discipline and duty not as abstract notions, but as the living bone and sinew of their profession. He was, by accounts from those who served beneath him, a competent and measured commander, neither reckless nor overtly sentimental, a man who believed in doing his job with efficiency and precision. U-156 itself was a Type ICSI U-boat, a vessel of substantial size and range for the submarine service, over 200 feet long, and capable of remarkable endurance in the vast reaches of the Atlantic. These boats were the workhorses of Dönitz's fleet, the ones entrusted with the long cruises into distant waters where they would hunt alone for weeks on end, sustained by discipline and routine, and the strange brotherhood that forms among men enclosed together in steel and shadow. The submarine was already seasoned by the time September 1942 arrived, already scarred by depth charges and the thousand small anxieties that accompany a hunting vessel through enemy waters. Hartenstein had commanded U-156 for roughly a year, long enough to know every creak and groan of the boat, every man's competence and temperament, the way a captain comes to understand a living vessel as an extension of his own consciousness. The rhythm of a U-boat's existence is one of long stretches of watchfulness punctuated by moments of acute danger. Days dissolve into nights without distinction below the surface, and the crew works by the clock and by the needs of the boat, always listening, always ready. The typical complement aboard U-156 would have been roughly 50 men, commanders and officers, engineering specialists, radio operators, the lookouts, and the men who fired the torpedoes from their tubes. They lived in extraordinary intimacy and constraint, sharing bunks in rotation, eating in shifts, moving through narrow passages with practiced efficiency. A U-boat is perhaps one of the most isolated fighting machines ever created, a vessel that cuts itself off from the world and depends entirely on its own resources, its crew's training, and the competence of its captain. Every man aboard knows that the ocean surrounding them is both their hunting ground and their potential grave. Hartenstein's temperament in those months before the Laconia seemed marked by a certain professional weariness, though one must be cautious about reading too much into fragmentary historical records. He had seen enough of war to understand its machinery, its terrible logic, and yet he appears to have maintained something that might be called moral awareness, a quality that would become profoundly relevant in the days ahead. He was not, from what emerges in testimony, a man given to cruelty for its own sake, nor was he of the fanatic class that some submarine commanders represented. Rather, he seems to have belonged to that quieter majority of military professionals who accept their orders and execute them with competence, even when doubt whispers at the edges of consciousness. The assignment that brought U-156 to the waters off West Africa in September was routine by the standards of submarine warfare, a hunting patrol seeking targets of opportunity among the merchant vessels that still attempted to move supplies across the Atlantic, despite the U-boat menace. The boat had been at sea for some weeks already, and the crew would have settled into the rhythms of their existence, the regular watches, the maintenance of equipment, the small economies of movement and speech that characterize life in such close quarters. There is something almost meditative about such patrols, a quality that observers have noted repeatedly, the long stretches of nothing broken by moments of electric intensity when a target appears on the horizon. What were the thoughts that occupied Hartenstein's mind in those final hours before his encounter with the Laconia? One cannot know with certainty, of course, but the historical record suggests a man maintaining the professional demeanor expected of him, attending to the details of command while carrying whatever private reservations or anxieties he may have harbored. He would have been aware, as all U-boat commanders were, of the general directive from Berlin: seek targets, sink them, minimize risks to the boat. This was the core of his operational mandate, simple in its statement, complex in its execution. The ocean at that latitude in September carries its own hazards: weather systems that form suddenly, aircraft that patrol certain areas, the unpredictable appearance of convoy escorts. U-156 and Hartenstein were simply another predator among many hunting those waters, another link in the great maritime chain that Dönitz had built to strangle British commerce and the movement of materials that sustained the Allied war effort. Neither the boat nor its captain possessed any foreknowledge of what was about to unfold, no warning that their next target would pull them into an episode that would ultimately reverberate through military courts and historical memory for decades to come. The Laconia was simply another ship, another shape moving across the dark water, its hull containing soldiers and civilians, and Italian prisoners of war, who themselves had no idea that their fates and Hartenstein's were about to become entangled in a way that would expose the raw nerves of naval warfare and human obligation. The submarine awaited the night, as submarines do, patient and quiet in the deep, its crew performing their functions with the methodical precision of men who have been trained to believe that competence and adherence to protocol are the best defense against the chaos of war. Hartenstein stood or sat in his command position, alert to whatever the ocean might deliver, unaware that history was moving toward him with the inevitability of a dark tide, that within hours the decisions he would make, or fail to make, would become the subject of intense moral scrutiny and historical debate. The night of September 9th held the Atlantic in a peculiar stillness. Around midnight, as most aboard the Laconia had settled into their narrow berths or claimed space on the crowded decks, a soundless disturbance moved through the dark water. Kapitän Hartenstein, commanding the Type ICSI U-156, had positioned his submarine with patient precision, and now, in those hours when the ocean seems to hold its breath, the order came to fire. 2 torpedoes slid from their tubes with a soft metallic hiss, accelerating into the black beneath the surface. The Laconia, a vessel of nearly 13,000 tons, painted white and marked unmistakably with red crosses and bold lettering, moved forward in ignorance toward the moment that would splinter her into history. The first torpedo struck near the bow just after 1 in the morning. What happened in the seconds after is a tapestry woven from countless individual experiences, many recorded in fragments, others preserved only in memory and the slow fading of survivor accounts. The impact itself was a violence that woke the sleeping and sent tremors through the sleeping in dreams they could not quite grasp. A second explosion followed minutes later, lower in the hull, rupturing compartments and opening the ship's belly to the Atlantic's patient infiltration. Those still in their bunks felt the deck tilt sickeningly beneath them, and the sound, not a single noise but a chorus of groaning metal, shattering fixtures, the tumble of everything loose, filled the corridors with disorientation. On deck, a chaos less physical than psychological took hold almost at once. Soldiers in khaki, roused from sleep, found themselves moving through darkness without the steadying presence of clear command. The Laconia's crew, numbering nearly 200, were themselves struggling to assess the severity of the damage, to remember their own training, to move toward the positions they had drilled for in the safety of harbors far away. But even as alarm bells sounded, a clanging that seemed to belong to some other, safer reality, the ship was already listing noticeably to starboard. The slope of the deck became a slope that sent men sliding, grasping, falling toward a tilt that promised they would not right themselves. And then there were the Italian prisoners of war. Locked below deck in the Laconia's hold, sealed away from the armed soldiers who stood guard, These men found themselves in a darkness suddenly absolute. The lights had failed. There was water entering their prison, water that rose with an awful inevitability, pooling around their feet, climbing toward their knees. The hatch above them remained closed, whether by procedure, by panic, by the simple fact that no one topside had thought to send word down. Those men faced a doom that seemed geometrical in its certainty. Some historians have placed as many as 80 Italian POWs in that hold. Others suggest the number varied. What is certain is that the compartment became a tomb, and the sounds that carried up through the ventilation shafts, cries in a language that few of the English-speaking soldiers around them could pass, added a layer of anguish that would lodge itself in the memories of survivors for the rest of their lives. The scramble for the lifeboats was not, as might be imagined, a rout of pure panic. There were acts of discipline, officers directing men toward the boats, with a courtesy that seems almost unimaginable in retrospect. A young officer might have said, quietly, to those around him, "This way, lads. Steady, there is time enough." And men, shaped by years of military order, responded to that tone, as if obeying a law older than survival itself. Yet simultaneously, elsewhere on the decks, the scene was one of urgent desperation. There were not enough lifeboats. This was not unusual for the time. Regulations allowed far fewer lifeboat spaces than the ship carried souls, but the knowledge of this mathematical inadequacy struck home only as men realized it was no longer a theoretical problem, but a lived one. The Laconia carried, if the records are precise, 22 lifeboats and 5 rafts. Aboard were approximately 600 soldiers, 200 crew members, many women and children who had been evacuated from Gibraltar as war crept closer to that bastion, and as mentioned, somewhere between 80 and 200 Italian prisoners locked in the hold below. The mathematics resolved themselves into a stark reality. Not everyone would have a boat, not even close. Some men would be choosing, in the span of minutes, whether to climb down the ropes dangling from davits toward the small wooden craft suspended above the water, or to wait, to hope, to perhaps jump when the moment came. As the Laconia's stern rose higher, for she was settling by the bow, her propellers eventually breaking the surface of the water in a grotesque display, the decision became less of a choice and more of a physical certainty. Men began to enter the water, some lowered in boats, others sliding down ropes, still others simply stepping off what had become an increasingly vertical plane and falling into an ocean that, on this September night, held a temperature that would slowly steal the warmth from human flesh. The water itself seemed almost peaceful, except for the movement of bodies in it, the splashing, the calls for help, the eerie light cast by the burning ship reflected on the surface. Many of the soldiers wore life jackets, those cork or kapok-filled vests that provided buoyancy, but not comfort, not warmth, and crucially, not rescue. They floated in the darkness, waiting, aware of the physics that governed their survival. Hypothermia in the Atlantic in September does not announce itself loudly. It arrives as a creeping numbness, a gradual fog in the mind, a slow dimming of the will. Some of the men bobbing in the water would have been young, 18, 19, boys who had never been to war before, who had been transported on this ship as reinforcements for the fighting in North Africa, and who now found themselves in a dark ocean, separated from their units, unaware of where the boats had gone, or whether rescue would arrive. Within an hour, perhaps 2, the Laconia had slipped beneath the surface. The ship went down by the bow, her stern swinging up into the air one final time, and then she was gone, leaving behind only debris, oil, the small scattered lifeboats, and hundreds of men clinging to whatever would float. They could see the silhouettes of those boats nearby, dimly. Some boats had full crews of oarsmen, others were so crowded that men hung from the sides in the water, gripping the gunwales, their legs extended below them into the cold and dark. The radio operators aboard the lifeboats, for some of the boats carried portable wireless sets, had already begun sending distress signals before the ship went under, messages that radiated outward into the night, calling for help, calling for rescue, calling toward an uncertain response from whatever Allied forces might be in the region. The question that seemed to hang in the darkness over those scattered lifeboats was profoundly simple. Who would come? Would British or American ships respond to the distress calls? Would there be rescue? And if so, how long would it take? The men in the boats and in the water could see other boats nearby but could not reach them. They could feel the Atlantic working against them, testing them in a way that no training could have fully prepared them for. And somewhere in the darkness beyond them, moving slowly through the water with only a periscope to see by, the U-156 remained, silent now, her immediate task complete, her commander considering what to do next in a moment that would, in ways both he and no one aboard could have fully anticipated, reshape the history of submarine warfare and the very meaning of mercy in war. What happened next in the darkness would remain, for many who survived it, almost inexplicable. In those first moments after the Laconia slipped beneath the Atlantic swells, the U-156 had already begun its methodical withdrawal, slipping back into the depths where submarines belonged, where they were safest, where the rules of underwater warfare demanded they remain. And yet something stayed Hartenstein's hand as his first officer plotted their course away from the chaos above. Something made him pause. The screams carried through the water in a way that perhaps only a captain accustomed to reading the ocean's moods could fully comprehend. Hartenstein was not a man given to spontaneous sentiment. He had risen through the ranks of the Kriegsmarine on the basis of tactical precision and discipline. But standing in the conning tower that night, listening to the cries of hundreds of men thrashing in the black water, he found himself confronting a choice that would echo through the rest of his life. In the distance, the lifeboats were lowering, but they could never accommodate everyone. Around the survivors, the sea was indifferent and cold, temperatures dropping steadily as September wore toward autumn. How long could a man last in water of 48 degrees? Perhaps an hour, perhaps less. It was a decision, historians have noted with careful qualification, that seemed to contradict every operational doctrine, every survival instinct that governed submarine warfare. To surface was to expose himself completely. The U-146 would become a target, visible and vulnerable, silhouetted against the pale glow of the flares and emergency lights that Laconia survivors were lighting in desperate hope of rescue. Any Allied aircraft, any destroyer or corvette responding to distress signals would have in Hartenstein's surfaced submarine a gift from the gods of war, a stationary, impossible-to-miss target. And yet he gave the order. The conning tower broke the surface with a slow, deliberate motion. The U-156 rose into the firelit night, like something returning from the dead, water cascading from her hull and deck guns. And as she surfaced, as her crew emerged blinking into the chaos of the wreck, Hartenstein took a step that marked him forever, a step that would frame him as either a humane officer following conscience or an insubordinate commander overstepping the boundaries of his duty, depending on which historians and judges you asked. He began pulling survivors aboard. The logistics of this were staggering in their impracticality. A U-boat was designed to carry between 40 and 70 men, cramped into steel tubes where every cubic inch served a military function. She had no medical facilities, no capacity for humanitarian cargo, no provisions meant for anyone beyond her operational crew. And yet as Hartenstein positioned his boat alongside the struggling swimmers, his crew began the exhausting work of hauling wet, traumatized, half-frozen men up the narrow hull and through the hatches. Some were soldiers, some were Italian prisoners of war, shackled men who had been transferred to the Laconia just days before. Some were crew and passengers, civilians caught in the machinery of total war. The numbers grew, 20, 30, 40. Some sources suggest that at its height, the U-100 men clinging to her hull, balanced precariously on the deck and the guns, gripping whatever surface they could find in the darkness. It created an image that was almost hallucinatory in its strangeness. A German U-boat, a weapon of war, festooned with human beings like a lifeboat itself. Its normally sleek, predatory form transformed into something more closely resembling a floating raft. The submarine sat lower and lower in the water, weighted down by this extraordinary human cargo, moving with agonizing slowness. One must wonder what passed through Hartenstein's mind in those hours. Was he calculating the risk in precise military terms, weighing the value of this humanitarian gesture against the tactical exposure? Or had some deeper human impulse simply overridden the careful calculus of survival? The historical record suggests it was both. Hartenstein was not naive. He understood the danger, but he also seemed to understand something else, that to leave these men to die when rescue was within his power was itself a choice, and not a neutral one. There is a particular poignancy in imagining the survivors themselves during this period. For many, the shock of being pulled from the ocean by a German U-boat must have been surreal, almost incomprehensible. The enemy had become the rescuer. The instrument of their ship's destruction had become their lifeline. Some accounts suggest confusion and even fear among the rescued. Was this some kind of trap? Others record gratitude so profound that it temporarily suspended the categories of war and enemy, replacing them with something simpler and more fundamental, the recognition of one human being reaching across darkness to save another. As Hartenstein worked through the night, maintaining his position despite the growing risks, other elements of this strange rescue were already unfolding. Messages were being dispatched. Signals were crackling through the radio on multiple frequencies. The U-156 was no longer simply a silent predator in the dark. It had become something that required communication, that needed to broadcast its intentions, to appeal to the wider world for safe passage, while it conducted what was essentially a mercy mission. It was almost as if, by surfacing and taking survivors aboard, Hartenstein had fundamentally altered the nature of his vessel's presence in the ocean. He had made it, in that moment, something other than a weapon. Whether that was wisdom or folly, whether it was an act of conscience or a catastrophic breach of military protocol, the consequences would unfold in the hours to come, reshaping not only Hartenstein's fate, but the future of submarine warfare itself. What emerged from the dark water over the following hours was perhaps the strangest vessel ever to sail the Atlantic. U-156, a sleek predator designed for silence and swift submersion, had transformed into something else entirely. Along her hull and superstructure, lifeboats hung like ornaments. Men clung to her railings, draped themselves across her conning tower, their bodies stacked and interwoven in a tangle of wet uniforms and desperation. Some dangled ropes over the sides, creating a precarious ladder for the semi-conscious to climb from the churning black below. Others simply held on, their fingers locked in a grip that would leave marks for days if they survived to count them. Hartenstein moved methodically through the chaos, with an almost surgical precision. The submarine's crew, men trained in the art of killing from concealment, had become something nearer to lifeguards. They hauled the near-drowned over the rail, with care that seemed incongruous given the nature of their machine. An Italian prisoner who couldn't speak German was guided gently across the hard deck. A British soldier, delirious from swallowing seawater, was wrapped in a blanket that a U-boat sailor had surrendered from his own narrow bunk. The submarine itself seemed to groan under the weight of human cargo it was never meant to carry. Her ballast tanks strained. Her deck was a refugee camp in miniature. Around them, the water remained alive with struggling forms. More lifeboats circled, finding their way to the U-boat's hull as if drawn by magnetism. The submarine became a hub, a point of convergence in an otherwise indifferent ocean. And in those hours, these few precious hours that seemed to stretch outside of ordinary time, something almost unthinkable was occurring. Men who had been enemies moments before, who had been trained to regard one another with professional hatred, were now bound by a shared biology of survival. An Italian POW coughed up seawater into a German sailor's hands. A British officer rested his head against the submarine's steel skin. A Laconian crew member, having lost everything in minutes, was offered a cigarette by the very men who had sunk his ship. It was a vista that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. Later, men would struggle to articulate what they had seen. How does one describe the impossible made real? The impossibility lay not in the rescue itself, but in what it revealed about the permeability of enmity when death becomes the alternative. The submarine, the weapon of the deep, the instrument of England's terror and America's mounting dread, had become a lifeboat. The mechanism of war had bent, however briefly, toward mercy. But there was something deeply unsettling about the image itself. Photographs taken by those aboard captured a scene that looks almost surreal in its contradiction. A military vessel, built for destruction, bristling with men it was never designed to support. Bodies in various states of shock and exhaustion. The conning tower festooned with lifeboats, as if dressed for some grim carnival. One observer would later describe it as resembling a mother whale surrounded by its desperate young, though that comparison, while poetic, carries an optimism the reality did not quite justify. The tension was palpable beneath the surface of cooperation. Every man aboard that U-boat, both the rescued and the rescuers, understood an unspoken fragility. The submarine's exposure was complete, her position was known. Any Allied ship or aircraft that happened upon them could turn this scene of rescue into another scene of annihilation. Hartenstein knew this. His crew knew this. The soldiers and civilians clinging to his hull knew this too, perhaps more acutely than anyone. They had already experienced one sinking. The prospect of another, delivered by Allied forces they had been fighting alongside just weeks before, was almost unbearable in its symmetry. Yet the work continued. More survivors were hauled from the water. The Laconia's lifeboats, remarkably, remained largely intact, and these now served as floating way stations. Survivors who had made it to them were tended to. The Italian prisoners of war, whose status remained ambiguous, belonging neither fully to the Allies who had captured them, nor to the Germans now apparently saving them, were offered water and what shelter could be mustered in the tropical night. The British and South African soldiers, still traumatized by the swift violence of the torpedoing, found themselves receiving aid from the very naval force they had been trained to oppose. What made this tableau even more remarkable was that it was not unprecedented, but it was rare enough to stand out in memory. There had been occasions during the war when U-boat captains had aided survivors. There would be occasions in the future, but nothing quite matched the scale of what Hartenstein orchestrated. By some estimates, over 200 survivors were brought aboard or assisted by U-156 in those hours. By others, the number was somewhat lower, though the exact count matters less than the sheer audacity of the attempt. This was rescue at industrial scale, a U-boat transformed into an emergency aid station in the open Atlantic. The ship's captain, William Ski Martin, emerged from below decks where he had been attempting to organize what remained of the Laconia's command structure. He was escorted to Hartenstein's presence. The meeting between these two men, the liner's captain and the submarines, was marked by a kind of mutual exhaustion and unspoken understanding. Martin understood immediately what was being attempted. Hartenstein, for his part, was beginning to realize the magnitude of what he had committed himself to. This was not a quick mercy. This was becoming an operation, a sustained effort that would require hours more of vulnerability. Around them, as night deepened, the ocean seemed to hold its breath. The water was strangely calm, as if some great force had paused its motion to observe what human beings would do with this unlikely stage. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent as always to the affairs of those below. The U-156 bobbed gently beneath her cargo of desperate humanity, a contradiction made flesh and steel, a moment of the impossible, wedged between the machinery of war. In the hours that followed the torpedoing, as daylight began its slow withdrawal across the Atlantic swells, Captain Hartenstein faced a decision that would reverberate through the remainder of the war and long into the judgment chambers that would follow. The U-156 sat low in the water, her deck crowded now not with her own crew, but with the desperate and the drowning, soldiers clinging to her hull, survivors wrapped in blankets, their bodies still convulsing with cold and shock. Around the submarine lay a grotesque garden of lifeboats, some capsized, some barely afloat, and in the deeper darkness beneath the waves, countless more souls sinking into the silence. For a submarine commander, the calculation was straightforward and brutal. Surface rescue meant vulnerability. It meant broadcasting your position to any Allied vessel or aircraft within the vast radius of the radio signals he was about to transmit. It meant abandoning the fundamental principle of U-boat warfare, invisibility, the ghost-like passage through enemy waters that had made the German submarine fleet so devastatingly effective. Every moment spent stopped, stationary, glowing in the dark like a beacon to those who hunted him, was a moment closer to destruction. Yet Hartenstein made the choice that would haunt him forever. He gave the order to send out a radio message, transmitted in the open, unencrypted, where anyone listening across the electromagnetic spectrum could hear it. The words that went out across that September darkness were a desperate appeal, a message directed toward the Allies, toward the very forces that sought his death and the death of his crew. He was asking for something nearly unthinkable in the logic of war: a temporary truce, a humanitarian corridor, safe passage for rescue vessels, so that the lives still struggling in the water might be saved. The message was simple, almost stark in its directness. A U-boat captain was announcing to all listeners, friend and enemy alike, that he had survivors aboard, that he needed assistance, that he was engaged in rescue operations, and requested that these rescue efforts not be attacked. One can only imagine the extraordinary vulnerability that must have coursed through his body as those words left the transmitter, spreading outward like ripples that he could never contain or reclaim. By broadcasting this message, by identifying the position of his submarine and its intentions, he had placed himself and his entire crew in a state of helplessness that few military commanders would ever voluntarily embrace. The decision carries with it a quality that would eventually trouble the conscience of history itself. Here was a man trained in the cold calculus of naval warfare, a professional soldier operating within a system that had been engineered for maximum efficiency and minimum mercy. Yet he chose, in that moment, to set aside the logic that governed his existence and appeal instead to something deeper, to the common humanity that might, conceivably, still exist somewhere on the other side of these waters. The radio frequencies crackled with his appeals for hours. The transmissions included detailed information about the position of the U-156, the number of survivors aboard, the distress of those still in the water. This was not a subtle signal meant to evade detection. This was a clear, intentional announcement to any force that could listen. One wonders what thoughts moved through the minds of those survivors as they heard these words being sent, as they realized that their life now depended on the mercy of distant strangers, on the goodwill of forces that logic suggested should remain indifferent to their fate. In the darkness above the ocean, in the radio stations of passing ships and distant bases, operators received these transmissions and relayed them upward through the chain of command. A German U-boat was rescuing people. A German U-boat was asking for protection to continue its humanitarian work. The sheer contradiction of such a message, the predator calling out for mercy toward its prey, created a kind of cognitive dissonance among those who received it. And for a brief, almost miraculous span of hours, the impossible seemed to become possible. The appeal was heard. The message, in its desperation and directness, appeared to touch something in the consciousness of those with the power to respond. Forces began to move toward the position indicated by Hartenstein's transmissions. Ships that might have otherwise remained distant from the scene began to alter their course. The waters that had been so full of death and chaos seemed momentarily to pause, to acknowledge that something other than destruction might be attempted here. Hartenstein, in sending those open radio signals, had essentially offered his submarine as a hostage to the better nature of his enemies. He had said, in effect, "Here is my position, here is my vulnerability, I am trusting you not to exploit it." This was an act of faith in wartime, which is to say, it was an act that most military doctrine would have deemed madness. Yet he chose it nonetheless, and for a brief window, hours really, though they must have felt like days, that faith appeared to hold. The radio continued to transmit. the U-156 remained stationary. More lifeboats were gathered, more survivors pulled from the water, the submarine becoming in those hours less a weapon of war than a floating hospital, a refuge, a symbol of something unexpected breaking through the machinery of conflict. The appeals continued into the dark, into the Atlantic night, as if Hartenstein's voice could somehow compel the universe itself to acknowledge the value of what he was attempting, to grant him and those clinging to his hull the protection that logic suggested he had no right to expect. Hartenstein's radio calls, broadcast in plain language across the waters, had reached ears far beyond the German naval command structure. The message was unmistakable, almost plaintive in its directness. Here lay survivors of the Laconia, thousands of them, clinging to lifeboats and makeshift rafts, and a single U-boat was doing what no military vessel had been ordered to do. It was asking for help. It was offering mercy in an ocean that had largely forgotten such gestures. And in that moment, something extraordinary began to unfold across a stretch of the mid-Atlantic that would soon become a scene unlike almost any other recorded in the entire Second World War. Word spread through the German submarine fleet with remarkable speed. U-156 was not alone in the vast underwater domain. Other U-boats, prowling the same waters in their endless hunt for Allied shipping, intercepted Hartenstein's transmissions and received orders to converge on the position. These were not rescue vessels. They were weapons of war, designed to kill and sink. Yet here they came, responding to a call that transcended the usual brutality of submarine warfare. U-507, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Harro Schacht, received the summons and altered course toward the growing disaster. U-506, under Captain Lieutenant Eberhard Gott, did likewise. These men and their crews understood what they were being asked to do, and perhaps more importantly, they understood why. The sight of thousands of human beings dying in the darkness, while their vessels had the capacity to help, would have weighed heavily on any conscience, even one hardened by years of war at sea. The arrival of these additional submarines created a surreal spectacle that would remain etched in the memories of those who witnessed it. By morning, the surface of the ocean had transformed into something resembling an improvised rescue station, a floating tableau of humanity suspended in a desperate arrangement. Multiple U-boats, their sleek hulls breaking the surface, became mobile platforms for the rescued. Survivors clambered aboard wherever possible, clustering on the conning towers, clinging to the hulls, crowded in every available space that could support human weight. The submarines had not been designed for this purpose. They were cramped, claustrophobic vessels, optimized for hunting prey, not sheltering it. Yet their crews made do, crowding survivors below deck when space allowed, distributing what water and food could be spared, tending to the most severely injured. But the U-boats were only part of the equation that had begun to form. News of the humanitarian effort had traveled beyond the German naval network. Vichy French ships, vessels operating under the French government that had come to terms with Nazi occupation and remained in nominal control of colonies and certain naval assets throughout the Atlantic and Mediterranean, also received word of the disaster. The Vichy authorities, whose relationship with the Axis powers was complicated and pragmatic rather than ideological, saw an opportunity, or perhaps experienced a genuine humanitarian impulse, to participate in the rescue. The Vichy French cruiser Gloire and other French naval vessels began to move toward the coordinates where Hartenstein had called for assistance. The thought of French ships coordinating with German submarines, two nations technically at odds, working in tandem to save lives rather than take them, speaks to something profound about the moment. In that particular stretch of ocean, the usual rules of conflict had been suspended, replaced by a more ancient and fundamental code. The growing assemblage of rescuers created an oddly peaceful scene, or as peaceful as anything could be amid such suffering and tragedy. Survivors were being transferred between vessels, their conditions stabilized where possible, their immediate chances of rescue improving by the hour. There were soldiers, many of them Italian prisoners of war, who had initially feared what German submariners might do to them, only to discover that in this instance they would receive the same care as any other victim of the disaster. There were civilians, women and children among them, pulled from the water with gentleness by men trained in warfare. There were British soldiers, members of the forces that Germany was at war with, being sheltered and fed by their enemies. The ocean, so often a place of cold calculation and lethal encounter, had momentarily become something else, a theatre of unexpected compassion, a space where the logic of war had been held in abeyance. The Vichy French vessels brought additional resources that the U-boats, constrained by their submarine design, simply could not provide. Room below deck, proper medical supplies, fresh water in quantities sufficient to sustain hundreds. As the hours passed, and more survivors were located and brought aboard, a kind of maritime organization emerged among the diverse fleet, the Germans and the French, working side by side, coordinating their movements, sharing information about survivor locations and conditions. Hartenstein had transmitted messages requesting safe passage, begging the Allied forces, the British and American navies, to refrain from attacking the rescue operation that was unfolding in their territory. He had explicitly identified the survivors aboard as military personnel and civilians, making clear that this was not a military operation, but a humanitarian one. The gamble was calculated but not without risk. A U-boat on the surface is vulnerable in ways it never is when submerged. Yet for a time, it seemed as though the gamble might hold. The rescue operation continued through the night and into the following day, a remarkable achievement of coordination given the chaos that might have reigned instead. Survivors began to feel, for the first time since the Laconia had sunk beneath the waves, that they might actually live, that the randomness of war, which had suddenly removed them from the safety of a ship and cast them into the ocean, might now work in their favor instead. The presence of Vichy French ships, with their greater capacity and resources, had given substance to what had begun as Hartenstein's solitary decision to defy the expected brutality of naval warfare. And yet, even as the rescue unfolded in those dark waters with a strange and fragile grace, the ocean itself seemed to hold its breath. The survivors clinging to lifeboats and rope nets, the U-boats circling protectively, the Vichy French vessels drawing steadily closer through the night. All of it existed in a curious bubble, almost outside the war itself. But that bubble, delicate as it was, could not remain sealed forever. Somewhere above the mid-Atlantic, high enough that the men below could not yet hear it, an American four-engine bomber was already turning toward the coordinates that would soon transform mercy into catastrophe. The B-24 Liberator, that workhorse of the air war, had been conducting a routine patrol across the Atlantic shipping lanes when the radio signals picked up by Hartenstein reached other ears as well. Those open broadcasts, calling for safe passage, calling for aid, calling for recognition of the humanitarian effort below, they transmitted into an airspace where everything that moved at sea was still, by the logic of war, a potential target. And in the fog of that logic, in the grinding momentum of combat operations where certainty was often a luxury, the approaching convoy below began to look like exactly what the bombing crews had been trained to hunt. We might pause here to consider the perspective of that American airman, if we listen with the kind of patient attention that history demands. They would have known of U-boats. Every crew member aboard a Liberator understood, in their bones if not always in words, that submarines were the wolves of the Atlantic, that they sank merchant ships and troop ships and supply vessels by the hundreds. To see a cluster of vessels gathered together, to pick up radio chatter in German, to observe what might appear to be a coordinated naval formation, all of this would have registered through a very particular filter. The possibility that this might be something other than a U-boat threat, that mercy might actually be unfolding below, was not a thought that would have occurred, or could easily have occurred, in the compressed moment of a bombing run. The exact sequence of events in those final minutes remains somewhat blurred by testimony and the natural fog of war, that thickness that settles around moments of violence. But what we know, what the records and the survivor accounts tell us, is that the Liberator descended through the darkness and released its payload into the confusion of the rescue effort. Bombs fell, Some accounts speak of machine gun fire stitching across the water. The precise targets are less important, perhaps, than the effect. The careful gathering of human beings, the coordinated rescue that had been building for hours, simply shattered. The survivors who had only recently been pulled from the sea found themselves again in the water. The lifeboats that had been towed by the U-boats came apart. Men who had spent the night believing that they might actually live through this. That belief was extinguished in the flash and roar of high explosives. The U-boats, those vessels of mercy in those impossible hours, now had to dive, to abandon the rescue entirely, because to remain surfaced was to invite destruction. And what had been a moment of unlikely humanity quickly collapsed back into the ordinary brutality of war at sea. In the silence that followed, as the bomber circled once more and then turned back toward its base, with the sense that it had accomplished its purpose, that it had struck at an enemy formation and disrupted whatever operation had been underway below, the ocean's surface was left with wreckage, and more bodies, and more drowning men. Some of those saved would sink again. Some of the sailors and soldiers and prisoners who had been pulled up would slip back into the cold Atlantic. The humanitarian effort had lasted perhaps 8 hours, long enough to save several hundred lives, but also long enough that the interruption felt particularly cruel. What is striking, when you sit with this moment long enough to truly examine it, is the series of misunderstandings that had to align perfectly to create this tragedy. The American bomber crews were doing what they had been trained to do, following the logic of warfare that had been taught to them. They could not easily see, or did not think to consider, what was actually happening below. The radio signals that Hartenstein had sent out in his hope of creating a safe corridor, of appealing to civilized conduct, even in the midst of total war, had instead advertised the location of the rescue effort to anyone listening, Allied and Axis alike. The Vichy French, caught between defeated France and the continuing conflict, had their own ambiguities and their own priorities that would shape how they responded in the hours to come. And above all, there was the simple, crushing reality that in war, mercy requires pause, and pause requires security, and security was the one thing that no one in those waters could truly guarantee. The captain of a submarine cannot surface and rescue drowning men without exposing himself to air attack. The crews of merchant vessels cannot stop and pick up survivors if enemy submarines are known to be active in the area. The logic of self-preservation and the logic of human compassion exist in such painful tension during wartime that they can almost never both be satisfied at once. The American bombing, whether it was directed at the U-boats deliberately or whether it was simply a case of mistaken identity in the darkness and confusion, would become perhaps the most crucial moment in the entire Laconia saga, because it was not an isolated incident, it was a trigger. What happened in the next hours and days in Berlin, in the offices of Karl Dönitz and the German Naval High Command, would be shaped entirely by this event. The men who made decisions about U-boat operations would look at the rescue effort that had been interrupted, at the American bombing of what had ostensibly been a humanitarian effort, and draw conclusions that would echo through the rest of the war. The Liberators' bombs fell like iron rain into that impossible assemblage of mercy at sea, what had been, for a brief and fragile span of hours, a tableau of humanitarian restraint, a U-boat festooned with lifeboats, French destroyers steaming steadily through the swells, transformed, in instants, into something else entirely. Chaos, dissolution, the return of war's unmerciful logic. The American pilot, a young captain named Clarence Touchet, flying out of Ascension Island with his B-24 crew, had been briefed that German vessels were operating in the area. What he saw below, through the overcast that morning of September 16th, was what appeared to him to be a German submarine surrounded by ships in close coordination. It seemed, in that tactical calculus, precisely the sort of target a warplane exists to destroy. He gave the order. The bombs descended. The explosions erupted not against the submarine itself, which was agile enough to survive with minor damage, but against the clusters of human beings clinging to lifeboats and makeshift rafts around it. The men who had been, until that moment in the hands of their rescuers. The Italian prisoners of war, the British soldiers, the civilians, all of them scattered once more into the Atlantic's indifference. Again, the water filled their lungs. Again, the cold seized them. Again, the living had to cling to the dead and dying in an effort to stay afloat. What is so peculiar, so disorienting about this moment in the historical record is that nobody knew quite what to do next. Hartenstein, that quiet and resolute captain, had made his choice to rescue based on something that transcended operational orders, something that might be called human instinct or conscience, or simply the recognition that these were people drowning in front of him. He could not unsee them, he could not unhear them, but now, attacked while attempting that very rescue, he faced an impossible crossroads. To continue would expose his boat to further air attack. To leave would abandon men he had pulled from the sea. The decision, when it came, was quiet and devastating. Hartenstein ordered the U-156 to submerge. The lifeboats, so briefly buoyant with the presence of rescue, were cut loose. The submarine sank below the surface, carrying with it the weight of what it had begun and could not finish. Those left behind in the lifeboats watched the U-boat disappear into the darker blue below, watched their thread of hope sink away from them, and faced once more the enormity of the ocean and the uncertainty of whether they would survive another night. The French vessels nearby, the Amiable, the Annamite, continued their rescue efforts, pulling more men from the water, filling their decks with shivering, traumatized survivors. But the momentum had broken. The strange, temporary truce that had held for 18 hours was shattered like glass. The machinery of war had reasserted itself. An American pilot, following orders based on intelligence that was technically accurate but contextually catastrophic, had ended an experiment in mercy that the world hardly knew was happening. There is a peculiar silence in the accounts of this moment, a kind of historical muteness that surrounds the seconds immediately following those explosions. Survivors would later struggle to describe what they felt when the bombing began, when the men around them, whom they had come to believe might live, were suddenly torn away again by violence. Some felt abandoned. Some felt that the universe itself had turned malevolent. Some, perhaps, simply felt nothing at all, the capacity for feeling exhausted by shock. In the hours that followed, more ships arrived on the scene. Additional U-boats, summoned by Hartenstein's radio calls before the air attack, appeared on the surface to offer what assistance they could. The Vichy French vessels continued their patient work of gathering survivors from the water. The ocean itself seemed to have settled into a kind of grim routine, as if it were simply one more station on an endless journey through darkness and salt and cold. But something had fundamentally changed. The men in the water no longer trusted rescue. They no longer believed that the appearance of a ship or a submarine meant salvation was near. They had learned, in the space between hope and devastation, that the ocean offered no guarantees, that rescue could be real and then vanish, that humanity itself was fragile and contingent and subject to the caprice of military orders issued from distant headquarters by men who would never have to float in lifeboats and wonder if anyone was coming to save them. What happened in the aftermath of that bombing would echo backward and forward through time, creating ripples that no one in that moment could have fully anticipated. The attack itself was, from a purely tactical perspective, a success. An American pilot, doing his duty, had intercepted what appeared to be an enemy formation and had acted accordingly. But the moral dimension of that act, the bombing of rescue operations, the disruption of a humanitarian effort, created a shockwave through the military and political establishment that would reverberate for months and, as it would turn out, reshape naval warfare doctrine for generations. Hartenstein, when he brought the U-156 back to port days later, would face questions from his superiors about why he had attempted the rescue, why he had risked his vessel and crew for enemies of the Reich, why he had continued broadcasting in the open for so long, inviting discovery and attack. His answers were, by all accounts, simply stated. He had seen men drowning. He had the means to save them. The military logic of total war did not, in his view, supersede the basic human obligation to attempt rescue. It was, perhaps, a naive position. It was, one might argue, the only sane position available. What remains unclear, and here history itself becomes shadowed with ambiguity, is whether the decision-makers in Berlin fully understood what had occurred. The bombing attack was, after all, by American forces. The Vichy French ships involved in the rescue effort were technically still neutral or ambiguous in their allegiances. The whole situation existed in a kind of grey zone, a place where normal warfare seemed not quite to apply, or perhaps it applied all too much, and that was precisely the tragedy. The survivors who were eventually pulled from the water that day, who eventually reached shores and safety and solid ground beneath their feet, carried with them stories of this strange interlude. Some would speak of it to friends and family. Some would carry it silently, a weight they never quite managed to set down, and those who did not survive, who slipped beneath the waves in the aftermath of the bombing and never rose again, carried their silence with them into the deep, where voices become immaterial and all stories eventually end. By the time the rescue operations ceased entirely, when the French ships finally turned toward their home ports and the U-boats slipped back into their appointed patrols, more than 1,000 men had been lost in the attack on the Laconia. More than 400 had been saved by the concerted efforts of Hartenstein and the others. The calculus of survival had never been favorable in these waters, but in the space of a few hours, it had become far darker still. In the scattered aftermath of that terrible morning in the Atlantic, as the last of the Laconia's survivors were being pulled from the water by the Vichy French vessel Gloire, something far more consequential was unfolding in the halls of the German Naval High Command in Berlin. The news of what had transpired, a German U-boat openly rescuing Allied and enemy personnel, broadcasting in plain language across open radio frequencies, essentially announcing its position and vulnerability to any enemy listener within range, did not arrive in quiet channels. It moved through the highest corridors of military authority like a shockwave, each layer of command receiving it with a mixture of astonishment, indignation, and a cold, calculating concern. The very notion that Captain Hartenstein had acted with such profound mercy, and moreover, that he had done so without explicit authorization, struck at something deeper than mere disobedience. It was, from the perspective of Berlin's hardening perspective on total war, a dangerous deviation from the ruthless pragmatism that the submarine war demanded. Officers began to ask difficult questions in the privacy of their offices. How could a commander take such a risk for people designated as enemies? What kind of precedent did this establish? And perhaps most troublingly, what if other U-boat captains began to follow Hartenstein's example, abandoning their hunter's mentality to become rescuers, thus compromising the entire strategic purpose of the undersea campaign? The attack by the American bomber, though it had not been orchestrated by German command, had in some perverse sense resolved one difficulty while creating another, far more dangerous one. The humanitarian rescue had been interrupted, the moment of mercy shattered, and yet the fact remained that Hartenstein had tried. The fact remained that he had made contact with enemy vessels, had signaled his intentions, had exposed himself. To the officers in Berlin, who thought in terms of absolute advantage and strategic dominance, this was a kind of contamination, the introduction of humanitarian instinct into a domain that had been deliberately stripped of such sentiment. What happened next was neither sudden nor exactly coordinated in the way a direct order from a supreme commander might be. Instead, it was more like the crystallization of sentiment that had already been forming beneath the surface of German naval policy. Conversations began to take place. Memoranda were drafted. Questions were raised with increasing formality about the responsibilities of U-boat commanders in situations of distress, and underlying all of this was a single, unspoken agreement that such a thing, such openly displayed mercy, must not be allowed to happen again. The political dimension was equally significant, though it operated in a different register. The attack on the rescue vessels, perpetrated by Allied aircraft against a humanitarian effort, was framed by German propagandists with considerable skill as yet another instance of enemy ruthlessness. Here were the Americans and their allies, the narrative went, so determined to destroy the German U-boat fleet that they were willing to bomb their own people in the water. It was a useful story, emotionally powerful, and it served to harden the conviction among German naval personnel that the enemy understood only force and strategy, not honor or restraint. If the Allies would attack survivors in the act of being saved, the reasoning went, why should German submariners be bound by any other code? The irony, of course, was thick and bitter. The American pilot had almost certainly not known that the vessels below were engaged in a rescue operation. To him, they were simply enemy ships and U-boats gathered in close proximity, a tactical target too significant to ignore. His decision to attack, made in a fraction of a second at 30,000 feet with incomplete information, had inadvertently provided precisely the kind of justification that German High Command needed to formalize what it had begun to suspect: that mercy was not only impractical, but perhaps even disloyal to the broader aims of the war itself. Within the German Navy, particularly within the U-boat arm, the mood shifted in subtle but perceptible ways. There was no immediate proclamation, no official reversal of policy regarding survivors. But in the conversations between officers, in the briefings given to newly assigned captains, in the underlying current of command philosophy, a hardening was evident. The question had moved from, what should we do, to, what are we permitted to do, and from there, to, what can we afford to allow? The senior leadership of the Kriegsmarine had always understood that submarine warfare, at its essence, was a form of commerce destruction and deterrence. A U-boat's value lay in its ability to eliminate enemy shipping, to disrupt supply lines, to create fear among the maritime nations of the world. Every moment a submarine spent engaged in rescue operations was a moment not spent hunting. Every radio transmission calling for assistance was an exposure that could result in that submarine's destruction. These were not subtle calculations, but rather the basic mathematics of naval warfare. And yet Hartenstein had made a choice that suggested something else was possible, that even in the midst of total war, even in a submarine hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly port, a commander could decide that the human cost of his own actions warranted some attempt at mitigation. He had proven that such a decision was technically feasible, that it could be executed without immediately resulting in disaster, and that it might resonate with something in the conscience of his crew and of his broader naval community. Precisely this possibility, was what Berlin now sought to eliminate from consideration, not through crude punishment or dramatic denunciation, but through the far more effective mechanism of making such choices impossible to justify within the command structure itself. If a captain could be made to understand that rescue operations were not merely imprudent, but actually contrary to his duty, that they represented a form of disloyalty to the war effort and to his fellow submariners, then the contamination of mercy could be sealed off, contained, rendered impossible to spread. The political fallout was thus not primarily about the actions Hartenstein had taken. Those were, after all, extraordinary and unlikely to be repeated. Rather, it was about the institutional and ideological response they triggered. The German Navy was being pulled, inexorably, toward a doctrine that would eliminate the very possibility of such choices. And that pull, that pressure from above, was now becoming irresistible. The stage was being set, the philosophy hardened, the command structure realigned, all in preparation for a proclamation that would make official what was rapidly becoming unofficial policy. In the months that followed the disaster in the Atlantic, as rescue ships still searched the waters and survivors began their long journey toward recounting what they had witnessed, a quiet but powerful shift was taking place within the German Naval High Command. At the helm of this transformation stood a man whose name would come to define the entire doctrine of the U-boat war, Karl Dönitz. And to understand how the Laconia incident would crystallize into an official command, we must first understand the man himself and the philosophy he had begun to forge in the depths of the sea. Dönitz was not, in the conventional sense, a new figure in naval warfare. He had served with distinction in the First World War as a U-boat captain, had survived the sinking of his own vessel, and had experienced firsthand the bitter sting of defeat and the strange, almost monastic camaraderie that bound submariners together in the tight quarters of their boats. By the time the Second World War began, he was no longer merely commanding individual submarines. He had risen to a position of extraordinary influence, that of Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, or head of the entire U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine. The title conveyed authority, but the scope of his vision extended far beyond bureaucratic titles. Dönitz was not simply managing vessels and crews, he was shaping a philosophy of naval warfare that would challenge the very foundations of how the Allies conducted their defense of the Atlantic. When Dönitz assumed control of the U-boat fleet, the submarine had already proven itself as a weapon of devastating potential. But Dönitz believed, with an almost visionary intensity, that the U-boat could be so much more than a mere weapon. It could be, in his estimation, the decisive instrument of the entire war. He called his tactical vision the Wolf Pack, Rudeltaktik, and the concept was elegantly simple in theory, though brutally complex in execution. Rather than deploying submarines individually across vast stretches of ocean, Dönitz would coordinate groups of them to attack in concert, overwhelming merchant convoys with concentrated force. The mathematics were compelling. If enough U-boats could be built, and if they could be positioned along the shipping lanes with sufficient coordination, perhaps, just perhaps, Germany could strangle the British Isles into submission by cutting off the flow of supplies that kept the island nation alive. The strategy required a particular kind of mind. It demanded not only tactical brilliance, but also a kind of cold calculus about the nature of modern warfare. And here, we find something worth pausing to consider. How does a military leader justify the methods necessary to achieve what he believes is a vital objective? The answer, in Dönitz's case, involved a gradual hardening of attitudes, a shift that did not happen overnight, but accumulated, almost imperceptibly, with each passing month of the war. As the Battle of the Atlantic intensified and the losses mounted on both sides, Dönitz began to articulate a doctrine that emphasized ruthlessness above all other considerations. In his commands and memoranda to his captains, in the speeches he gave to gatherings of submarine officers, he communicated a clear philosophy. The U-boat force existed to destroy enemy shipping. That was its purpose. That was its only legitimate purpose. Everything else, humanitarian considerations, the niceties of naval tradition, the unwritten codes that had governed warfare at sea for centuries, all of these were luxuries that the submarine arm could not afford. There was something almost seductive about this philosophy, particularly to young officers who had been shaped by Nazi ideology and who were eager to prove their worth in service to their nation. Dönitz did not typically speak in the language of Nazi propaganda or racial ideology. Instead, he spoke in the language of military necessity and professional duty. He was asking his men to embrace efficiency. He was asking them to think of themselves not as individuals bound by conscience, but as components of a larger machine, a machine designed to achieve victory. And if that machine required the subordination of individual morality to collective purpose, well, that was simply the nature of modern warfare. In the years before the Laconia incident, Dönitz's hardening doctrine had already begun to manifest itself in concrete instructions to U-boat commanders. There were growing directives about the treatment of survivors in the water. Communications between U-boat captains and naval headquarters reveal an increasingly unsentimental approach to the question of what to do when an enemy ship had been sunk and its crew was clinging to lifeboats or wreckage in the vast expanse of the ocean. The prevailing attitude, at least among the leadership of the U-boat arm, was that such questions were distractions from the primary mission. A U-boat that stopped to pick up survivors was a U-boat that was not hunting for its next target. A U-boat that surfaced to render aid was a U-boat that was vulnerable to attack from aircraft or from escorting warships. The mathematics of efficiency did not favor mercy. Yet it would be important to note, as we explore this darkening trajectory, that many U-boat captains, ordinary men, not ideologues, found themselves caught in an increasingly uncomfortable position. They had been trained in a naval tradition that extended back centuries, a tradition that included certain unspoken but deeply felt obligations toward those in distress at sea. Werner Hartenstein, the captain of U-156, was precisely this kind of man, shaped by the old traditions of the sea, yet now serving under a command structure that seemed determined to erase those traditions in the name of military efficiency. And this tension between individual conscience and institutional command would become, in many ways, the moral center of the drama that was unfolding. The Laconia incident, when it occurred, could not have arrived at a worse moment for Dönitz's carefully constructed philosophy. Here was an instance in which one of his own captains, acting on instincts that belonged to an older and more humane tradition, had chosen to surface his submarine and begin rescuing survivors from the water. Hartenstein had even broadcast an open radio signal, calling for assistance from any ship in the area, declaring his intention to rescue the stranded and requesting safe passage for his U-boat as it conducted this humanitarian operation. From Dönitz's perspective, this represented something far more serious than a simple act of mercy. It represented a kind of insubordination, a captain placing his own moral judgment above the strategic directives that had been handed down from above. Moreover, the aftermath of the Laconia incident, the terrible bombing, the deaths of both survivors and rescuers, the chaos and suffering that had resulted, seemed to Dönitz to validate his bleaker view of the nature of modern warfare. The Allies, in his interpretation, had responded to an act of mercy with an act of violence. They had attacked a U-boat that was in the process of saving lives. How could one make sense of such actions, except through the lens of a ruthless enemy that would exploit any gesture of kindness? And if that was the nature of the enemy, then surely the conclusion was clear. To continue making such gestures was not an expression of moral virtue, but rather a dangerous delusion that could only result in the deaths of one's own men. The atmosphere within German Naval High Command, in the days and weeks following the Laconia incident, grew tense and contemplative. Dispatches flew back and forth between the operational commanders at sea and the headquarters staff on shore. There were inquiries into what had happened, investigations into why a submarine captain had taken it upon himself to launch a rescue operation that had not been explicitly authorized. And there was, beneath all the official language and bureaucratic procedure, a fundamental question being worked out. How could the U-boat arm ensure that such incidents would not happen again? How could Dönitz consolidate control and establish, once and for all, the principle that military efficiency and strategic necessity must always supersede individual conscience or traditional maritime law? The answer, when it came, would be both elegant and chilling, a single written order that would attempt to enshrine in official doctrine what had until then existed only in the atmosphere of command, the principle that a U-boat's duty was to destroy enemy shipping and nothing more, and that any action taken in service of other goals, however humane those goals might appear, would constitute a violation of orders and a dereliction of duty. In the wake of the bombing, in those grey administrative spaces far from the Atlantic's rolling surface, something shifted in the machinery of war. The calculations changed. Dönitz, who had watched the photographs and heard the reports from U-156, who understood that his men had done something remarkable and been punished for it, began to move through the corridors of power with a clearer vision of what he believed the future of submarine warfare must become. The question that haunted the German Naval High Command was not whether mercy had a place in modern warfare. It did not, they had concluded, but whether the pursuit of mercy itself had become a liability that threatened to undo the U-boat arm's entire tactical doctrine. By late September 1942, just days after the Laconia survivors had been dispersed and the Mediterranean beaches had slowly given up their dead to the tide, Dönitz sat down to compose what would become one of the war's most infamous orders. It was not born in rage, though rage may have colored its margins. It was born, rather, from a cold logic, a calculation that the ocean was not a place for sentiment, and that every moment a submarine captain hesitated, every moment he surfaced to pull a drowning man aboard, every moment he spent radioing for help instead of diving to safety, was a moment in which his vessel, his crew, and the entire U-boat campaign became vulnerable. The order, when it came through to the fleet on September 17, 1942, was both simple and stark in its implications. U-boat commanders were instructed that rescue operations were to cease. They were forbidden from pulling survivors from the water. They were not to slow down for lifeboats. They were not to surface to offer assistance. And perhaps most tellingly, they were not to concern themselves with the fate of those left behind in the wreckage. The order spoke in careful, legalistic language, bureaucratic language that would, in years to come, become the subject of considerable historical and legal debate. But its operational meaning was unmistakable to any submarine captain reading it in his cramped quarters beneath the waves. Rescue was henceforth forbidden. Survival was no longer their responsibility. What is particularly striking, as historians have long noted with a kind of uneasy fascination, is the exact wording Dönitz chose. The order did not explicitly state that survivors should be harmed, that they should be hunted down or finished off as they floated helpless in the water. That was never the formal instruction. Instead, it was the negation of rescue that became the operative command. The U-boat captains were simply to withhold mercy, to pass by, to leave the drowning to their fate. And in the mathematics of war at sea, this distinction between passive abandonment and active destruction has long remained a thorny point of legal and moral interpretation. Does one bear responsibility for deaths one does not directly cause? For survivors one chooses not to save. The order seemed to exist in that uncomfortable space, and perhaps Dönitz understood that it did. The reasoning given for the order, as circulated through official channels, centered on the tactical vulnerability that rescue operations had come to represent. Too many U-boats, the argument went, had been lost because they had surfaced to render assistance. Too many submarines had been sunk because they had lingered near the scene of their own attack, distracted by the human cost of their torpedo strikes. The bombing of the rescue convoy, though officially blamed on American recklessness, and there was certainly recklessness in it, had served as the final argument for those who believed that humanitarianism at sea was a luxury the U-boat campaign could not afford. If American bombers were prepared to attack ships flying flags of truce and signals of rescue, then perhaps German submarines could not rely on such protections either. Better, then, to abandon the pretense altogether. There is something quietly chilling in the way the order seemed to release Dönitz's subordinates from an impossible moral tension. In the weeks after the Laconia, captains had faced a dilemma: obey the implicit demands of humanity and Christian ethics, as many of them had been taught, or obey the demands of tactical efficiency and military necessity. Now, the order seemed to say, there was only one master to serve. This was not a suggestion. This was not a moral principle open for interpretation. This was a command from the highest levels of the Kriegsmarine, issued with the authority of the Grand Admiral himself, backed by the structure and force of military discipline. One did not question such things. One did not weigh them against competing moral frameworks. One simply obeyed. And yet, the language of the order remained carefully constructed, almost as if Dönitz and those advising him were aware that these words might one day be read by others, in different circumstances, by men tasked with determining whether what had been commanded was justified, proportionate, or legal. The order spoke of necessity. It spoke of tactical imperatives. It spoke of the fact that rescue operations had indeed become dangerous, and that U-boat commanders bore a primary obligation to their own crews, to their vessels, to the larger campaign. No commander could be faulted, the logic seemed to suggest, for prioritizing the safety of his own men over the rescue of enemies or neutral parties. But beneath this careful scaffolding of rationalization lay something more troubling, and historians have long sensed it in the order's subtext. The order seemed to assume that if rescue was forbidden, if submarines were no longer bound by any obligation to attempt recovery of survivors, then the men drowning in the Atlantic would simply cease to matter. They would become abstractions. They would become acceptable losses, external costs of a campaign that had already demonstrated, beyond any reasonable doubt, its capacity for cruelty. The order did not create that cruelty, but it did formalize it. It did make it policy. It did remove from the shoulders of individual U-boat captains the burden of deciding, in the moment, whether a drowning man deserved rescue or whether he was merely an acceptable casualty of war. In the days and weeks after the order was distributed, copies of it began circulating through the U-boat fleet, read aloud in the tight quarters of steel vessels moving through dark water. What did men think as they heard these words? What did they feel, those captains who had only weeks before found themselves pulling exhausted soldiers from the Mediterranean swells, who had looked into the eyes of men grateful to be alive, who had experienced, however briefly, the sensation of serving something other than death? The historical record offers glimpses but not certainties. Some men accepted the order as a military necessity. Others seem to have carried it as a burden, a weight of guilt that they would later attempt to articulate or defend or deny when given the opportunity to speak about their war. The order itself had no name when it was issued. It was simply a command, a policy directive, a piece of military correspondence. But history would come to know it as the Laconia Order, and that name carries the full tragic weight of the incident that had preceded it. The ship, the rescue, the bombing, the order, all of it seemed to flow together, to form a single narrative arc that would define, in the minds of many, the particular moral collapse that submarine warfare had undergone by 1942. What had been, in the earliest days of the U-boat campaign, a form of warfare that at least maintained the pretense of restraint, where ships might be stopped and searched, where crews might be offered the chance to escape, had hardened into something far more brutal, far more total in its dismissal of the codes that had once, however fitfully, governed warfare at sea. The document itself arrived on September 17, 1942, distributed through the channels of the Kriegsmarine with the weight of a commander's direct command. Yet what Dönitz actually wrote, and what men understood him to mean, have remained two separate things ever since, separated by the fog of language, translation, and the terrible mathematics of wartime interpretation. The order, in its original German, reads with a precision that seems almost clinical on the surface. It instructs that the rescue of survivors, the fishing of drowning men from the water, is to cease. U-boat commanders are no longer to deviate from their patrol routes to save those struggling in the waves. They are not to surface near wreckage. They are not to carry survivors aboard their vessels. The reasoning offered was practical and cold. Such rescue operations slow the U-boat down, they expose it to discovery by enemy aircraft and escort vessels, and they distract the crew from the primary mission of sinking ships. It reads, in its starkest form, as a prohibition against mercy itself. But here is where the historical waters grow murky and contested, where even scholars who have spent decades examining this moment cannot quite agree on a single interpretation. The order does not explicitly command U-boat captains to actively harm survivors. It does not say, with unmistakable directness, that crews should shoot at lifeboats or ram rafts or machine gun men clinging to floating debris. What it says, rather, is that rescue operations must cease, that U-boats must not involve themselves in the saving of lives. The distinction may seem thin, perhaps even meaningless when a man is drowning, and yet this semantic space became the ground on which post-war arguments would be built, brick by brick. Some historians read the Laconia Order as an expression of military efficiency dressed in bureaucratic language, a way of saying that the U-boat fleet, as an instrument of war, must not be hamstrung by humanitarian concerns. Others detect something more sinister in its phrasing, an implicit authorization for crews to regard survivors as acceptable casualties of the campaign, obstacles to be disregarded, rather than impediments to be gently avoided. The ambiguity may have been intentional, or it may have been the natural consequence of trying to impose rigid command authority over the fluid chaos of maritime warfare, where circumstances change with the wind and the currents. What makes this particularly complex is that Dönitz himself, when he would later face interrogators and eventually the judges at Nuremberg, would offer his own interpretation of what he had written. He claimed the order was purely defensive, a practical adjustment to operational reality rather than a moral abdication. He said it meant only that U-boats should not break formation or expose themselves unnecessarily to rescue people who might be rescued by other vessels or who might already be beyond help. He argued, with some technical merit, that the order was not unique to Germany, that other navies, including the British and American navies, had issued similar guidelines during the war, prioritizing the safety of their own vessels over the rescue of potentially hostile swimmers. And this too is part of what makes the Laconia Order so persistently difficult to pin down. Dönitz was not entirely wrong in his defense. Naval commanders of multiple nations had made hard choices about when rescue operations became liabilities rather than obligations. The waters of the Atlantic were not safe spaces for humanitarian gestures. A U-boat or a destroyer that lingered to pull survivors aboard risked becoming a target itself. These are uncomfortable truths that do not excuse inaction, but they do complicate the moral clarity with which we might otherwise judge it. Yet the counter-argument, articulated by historians who have examined the order in its full operational context, suggests that the ambiguity itself may have been the point. Perhaps Dönitz crafted language that was sufficiently vague to allow U-boat commanders flexibility in their interpretation, while simultaneously providing him with plausible deniability afterward. A commander who read the order as a firm prohibition against rescue could justify his inaction to his conscience by reference to superior orders. A commander who read it more liberally and occasionally aided survivors could do so as well, interpreting the order as expressing a preference rather than an absolute command. The flexibility could cut both ways. What is unmistakable in the documentary record is that the order was communicated to the U-boat fleet as a hardening of policy, a drawing of a line that had previously been softer and less defined. Before Laconia, there were instances, recorded instances, of U-boat captains choosing to rescue survivors when circumstances permitted. After the order, such actions became more rare, more furtive, and when they did occur, they were often conducted quickly and with a sense of transgression, as if the crews involved understood themselves to be operating in violation of what their commander had instructed them to do. The psychological impact on the men in the submarines may be the truest measure of what Dönitz's order actually meant in lived experience. Whatever the precise wording, whatever the hairline distinctions between passive refusal to rescue and active disregard for human suffering, the effect on the consciousness of the crews was a numbing, a hardening, a recalibration of what was permissible and what was required. Men who might have once reached down to pull a drowning sailor from the waves, men who might have carried supplies or offered navigation to lifeboats, began instead to navigate past these scenes of suffering with their eyes forward and their hands folded in their laps, bound by an order they could cite and an authority they could not defy without risking court-martial or worse. Some U-boat captains of the period would later claim that they quietly ignored the Laconia Order when they felt they could do so safely, that they maintained an unspoken resistance to what they saw as an unjust directive. Others appear to have embraced it fully, seeing in it a reflection of their own hardening views about what war at sea demanded. And still others existed in the murky middle space, neither defying the order nor zealously enforcing it, simply conducting their patrols and moving through their days in a kind of moral autopilot, asking themselves as few difficult questions as possible. What remains genuinely open to historical debate, even now, is the question of intent. Did Dönitz issue the Laconia Order because he believed that U-boat resources were being squandered on rescue operations? This seems to be the most straightforward interpretation, supported by the stated reasoning in the document itself and by Dönitz's own testimony. Or did he issue it because he understood that the moral climate in naval warfare was shifting, that the gloves were coming off across all navies and all sides, and that to remain competitive as a military force, the Kriegsmarine could not afford to be constrained by humanitarian gestures. This too seems plausible, woven into the strategic logic of the moment. Or did he issue it, perhaps without fully acknowledging this even to himself, as a way of inscribing into law the kind of ruthlessness that modern industrial warfare seemed increasingly to demand? This is the interpretation that troubles historians the most, because it suggests an erosion not merely of policy, but of the very framework by which warriors had traditionally understood the boundary between acceptable military action and something that fell beyond the pale of even war's terrible permissions. The answer, scholars now understand, likely contains elements of all three. The order was practical, it was strategic, and it was also an expression of a worldview that saw mercy as a luxury the Reich could no longer afford. What remains genuinely uncertain is the degree to which each of these elements moved Dönitz's pen on that September day in 1942, and what he truly believed he was authorizing his U-boat commanders to do, or to refrain from doing, out there in the cold Atlantic waters, where men were drowning and no one was watching except the wind and the waves. The order arrived through official channels, printed and distributed, with the austere efficiency of military bureaucracy. For the men aboard the U-boats, those who would read it in the cramped quarters where diesel fuel hung thick in the air and the metal walls seemed to press closer with each fathom of depth, the Laconia Order represented something far more than a simple tactical directive. It was, in its way, a mirror held up to the nature of the war itself and to the men conducting it. Down in those iron tubes that cut through the black Atlantic, space was a luxury no submarine possessed. 14, 16, perhaps 20 men shared chambers so confined that a man could not stand fully upright, where the smell of sweat and machinery and human waste mingled into something almost tangible. In these conditions, a U-boat crew was not merely colleagues or fellow sailors. They were a single organism, dependent utterly on one another for survival. A single mistake by any man meant death for all. This created bonds of extraordinary tightness, and also, inevitably, a collective conscience that could not easily be compartmentalized from the orders handed down from above. Consider for a moment what the Laconia Order actually demanded of these men. It instructed U-boat commanders to refrain from rescuing survivors from ships they had sunk. More than that, it prohibited the provision of provisions, of direction, of any assistance whatsoever. For sailors steeped in maritime tradition, in the unspoken codes that governed behavior at sea since the first ships sailed beyond the sight of land, this represented a profound rupture. The sea demanded reciprocity. Today you might be the one clinging to wreckage. Tomorrow someone else might pass by and decide whether you lived or died. What remains perhaps most striking about the testimony of U-boat crews who lived through this period is not the uniform obedience to the order. It is, rather, the intricate and often invisible ways in which men found to resist it, or at least to live alongside it, without allowing it to completely consume their sense of self. Some crews, historians have noted, seem to interpret the order with a flexibility that surely exceeded what Berlin intended. They did not rescue, precisely, but they allowed lifeboats to attach themselves to the hull. They did not provide provisions, but perhaps a barrel of fresh water drifted into the current near a lifeboat by some mechanism that no official inquiry could quite determine. They did not abandon their essential role as warriors, but neither did they perform it with the theatrical cruelty that totalitarian regimes often seem to demand. Others, however, felt the weight of the order as a profound moral and psychological burden. The German Navy had maintained, at least until this point, a certain professional dignity in its conduct. There were rules, understood conventions, ways of behaving that separated the soldier from the savage. The Laconia Order, in the eyes of many who served, represented the moment when that careful distinction began to dissolve. In the letters that some of these men would eventually write, in the post-war testimony they would give, there emerges a picture of internal conflict that manifested not always in dramatic resistance, but in quieter forms of psychological strain. Think about the cumulative effect of this upon a young man, perhaps 22 or 23 years old, pressed into service in a submersible. He has already endured the ordinary horrors of warfare at sea. He has felt the depth charges, those acoustic nightmares that transform the ocean into an instrument of terror, that create pressure waves so violent they can collapse human lungs and shatter consciousness. He has watched comrades die. He has participated in the destruction of merchant vessels, of warships, of the entire infrastructure of human commerce and transport. This weight accumulates in the body and spirit, in ways both visible and invisible. Now, into this already profound moral complexity comes the Laconia Order. It arrives not as suggestion or guideline, but as formal directive from the highest levels of command, from Karl Dönitz himself, a man these sailors respected and feared in equal measure. Dönitz was not a figure one questioned. He was the architect of the U-boat strategy, the man whose vision had made these submarines the terror of the Atlantic. His authority was absolute, and it was reinforced by the entire apparatus of Nazi military discipline. Yet the order, paradoxically, asked these men to act in direct violation of something deeper than any military hierarchy. It asked them to violate their own humanity, and to do so knowingly, consciously, in a way that could not be attributed to the fog of battle or the accident of circumstance. In battle, when the depth charges are falling and survival itself is uncertain, a man might not see a survivor. But the order forced a different kind of choice. It required active participation in a decision to abandon the drowning. How did men respond to this psychological pressure? The evidence suggests that there was no single response. Some crews became what might be described as mechanically obedient. They carried out their orders as given, sank the ships they encountered, and did not emerge on deck to witness the aftermath. There is a psychological mechanism by which humans can compartmentalize, can separate the technical act of firing a torpedo from the human consequence of that act. The order, in a sense, formalized this compartmentalization into policy. Other crews, perhaps especially under commanders like Hartenstein, who had already demonstrated some capacity for independent moral judgment, found subtle ways to navigate between obedience and conscience. Hartenstein himself would continue to participate in warfare, would continue to sink ships. But the record suggests he also found occasions to bend the order rather than break it entirely. He was not openly defiant, for such defiance would have meant court-martial and execution. But neither was he, in every circumstance, rigidly mechanical in his adherence to the text. There is something almost unbearably poignant in the account of one U-boat crew member, recorded long after the war, who described the experience of reading the Laconia Order aloud for the first time. The man had to read it to the crew, and as he did, the air in the cramped compartment seemed to grow heavier. Some men said nothing, some asked quiet questions, but there was, in that moment, an understanding that something had shifted. The war had not changed in its essential nature, but the men conducting it had been given permission to change in theirs. Yet it would be a mistake to over-romanticize even this quiet resistance. Most U-boat crews, most of the time, most likely did what they were told. They were soldiers in a military hierarchy, and that hierarchy was supported by the entire crushing machinery of the Nazi state. They had families at home who might suffer for disobedience. They had experienced the regime's capacity for punishment. They were also, like all humans, limited in their moral agency by circumstance and fear. What perhaps emerges most clearly from the historical record is a sense of deep ambiguity, of men caught in a system that was demanding something unprecedented of them. The Laconia Order did not emerge in isolation. It was part of a larger hardening of the war at sea, a movement toward total warfare that recognized no distinction between combatant and civilian, that treated the ocean itself as a weapon and the men in it as acceptable casualties of attrition. By the time the order was issued, German U-boat crews had already participated in the sinking of hundreds of merchant vessels, many of them carrying civilians. They had already experienced the moral compromises that such warfare entailed. The order, then, did not introduce evil where none had existed before. Rather, it formalized something that was already present, and in doing so, it stripped away certain protective fictions. It made explicit what had perhaps previously remained implicit. And in this explicitness, it created a different kind of psychological burden. A man could sink a merchant ship and tell himself that he was a soldier doing his duty, that the decision to arm merchant vessels or to use them to supply war efforts had been made by politicians, not by him. But a man could not, by the same logic, explain why he would not rescue a drowning sailor if the opportunity presented itself, unless the chain of command had explicitly forbidden it. The submarines that continued to patrol the Atlantic after September of 1942 carried within them this tension. They were crewed by men who were, in many cases, skilled professionals, devoted to their crews, capable of extraordinary acts of bravery and discipline, and they were also men who had been ordered to abandon something that was central to their understanding of themselves as sailors and as human beings. How does a person integrate these two things? How does one remain oneself while obeying orders that seem designed to unmake oneself? The question would haunt many of these men for decades after the war. In the silence of the post-war years, in letters written to sons and daughters, in quiet conversations with other veterans who understood the particular weight of these choices, the men of the U-boats would return again and again to the question of what they had done and what they had failed to do, and whether the distinction between action and inaction even mattered in the context of war. The prosecution presented the Laconia Order as the centerpiece of their case against him, that brief, ambiguously worded directive that had rippled through every U-boat flotilla, freezing the impulse toward rescue in the hearts of men who had once pulled drowning sailors from the water. The document itself was simple enough to read aloud in court. Spare language, no ornate phrasing, just words that seemed to mean one thing while perhaps meaning another, depending on how one squinted at history. The prosecutors argued that the order was unambiguous, that Dönitz knew precisely what he was commanding, that the prohibition against rescue operations was a deliberate policy to ensure that German submariners would become instruments of a kind of oceanic ruthlessness unprecedented even in the industrial devastation of the Second World War. They painted him as a man who had made a conscious choice to transform his crews from soldiers into something less, men bound by duty to leave the drowning to die, to let the waves take what mercy had begun to save. But Dönitz's defense presented an entirely different reading of the same historical moment, and here we encounter one of those fascinating complications that historians still turn over in their minds, like smooth stones worn by tidal currents. His lawyers argued that the Laconia Order was not an instruction to abandon survivors to death, but rather a practical safety measure issued in response to the bombing that had devastated the rescue attempt. They suggested that Dönitz, observing the Allied response to the humanitarian effort, the attack from the skies that had scattered the lifeboats and killed so many of those being rescued, had concluded that U-boats could no longer safely engage in rescue operations without becoming sitting targets for aircraft. In this interpretation, the order was not cruel, it was cautious. It was not a command to coldness, but a recognition of a tactical reality, that in this war, mercy had become a liability, and that a U-boat commander who halted his boat to haul drowning men from the water was, in effect, offering that boat as a target to anyone in the sky with a bomb sight and a finger on a trigger. The distinction might seem subtle, even academic, yet it contained within it a profound moral question. Was Dönitz forbidding rescue because he wished to cultivate callousness among his men, or because he had observed, in the blood-stained aftermath of the Laconia incident, that rescue was functionally impossible in a war where humanity had become a tactical disadvantage? The courtroom grew quiet sometimes during these passages of testimony, the sort of silence that falls when people recognize they are approaching the boundary between clarity and ambiguity, between the satisfying verdict and the murky truth. What emerges from the historical record when one reads the trial transcripts with the kind of attention they deserve is something more complicated than either the prosecution or the defense fully acknowledged. Dönitz himself, during his testimony, was at various moments both defiant and reflective. He spoke of his responsibility to his men, of the impossible position he occupied as a commander, trying to wage war under circumstances that had become increasingly dehumanizing. He acknowledged the Laconia Order, but contextualized it, framed it, within the broader chaos of a military operation that had begun to devour itself. The prosecution pushed back, suggesting that responsibility cannot be so easily distributed, that command decisions have consequences regardless of the circumstances that prompted them. And round the arguments went, like U-boats circling in search of a target that kept disappearing into the depths. What is worth contemplating, as the mind drifts towards sleep, is that Nuremberg itself was attempting something that had never quite been attempted before at this scale. It was trying to establish that military commanders could be held accountable not merely for tactical decisions or military strategy, but for the moral character of the orders they issued and the culture they cultivated among their subordinates. The Laconia Order became a kind of nexus point for this question. If an order was technically ambiguous, could it be considered a war crime? If a commander issued an order that might have been militarily necessary, could he still be held responsible for the humanitarian consequences? If obedience to orders was the fundamental principle upon which military discipline rested, at what point did obedience become complicity? The court ultimately found Dönitz guilty, not specifically on the basis of the Laconia Order, but on a broader charge of waging aggressive war and crimes against humanity. The order itself was deemed circumstantial evidence rather than conclusive proof of intent, a distinction that some legal scholars have questioned ever since. Dönitz was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, a sentence that, given what others received, given the gallows that waited for some of the defendants at Nuremberg, represented a kind of cautious judgment, as if the court itself was uncertain whether it had quite understood what it was examining. But the legal arguments did not cease when Dönitz was led from the courtroom. They continued in law journals and academic papers, in the reflections of military ethicists and historians of the maritime conflict. And even now, decencies removed from those trials, the question lingers. Did Dönitz bear responsibility for transforming rescue from an impulse into a prohibition, or was he a realist navigating an impossible war where the very concepts of mercy and military necessity had become irreconcilable opposites? Perhaps the truth, as it so often is in these matters, contains elements of both. Perhaps Dönitz was both a military officer making a defensible tactical decision and a commander whose order, by whatever intention, did result in the deaths of men who might otherwise have lived. Perhaps that is precisely why the case remains so difficult to finally resolve, why it continues to occupy space in our collective memory of the war. The Laconia incident, and the order that followed, did establish something lasting in the history of naval law, however. Whatever the verdict on Dönitz's intent, the case made clear that future military commanders could not, with impunity, issue orders that, intentionally or through reasonable interpretation, prohibited the rescue of survivors. It became a precedent, a marker in the slowly evolving understanding that even in war, even in the profound moral chaos of industrial conflict, there remained obligations to something beyond victory. The sea, that vast and indifferent medium where the Laconia went down and where Hartenstein made his choice to rescue rather than hunt, began to acquire new laws, new customs, written slowly into the protocols that would govern naval operations in subsequent conflicts and into the distant, hopeful future. And so we arrive at a question that has no easy answer, one that oceanographers and ethicists and historians have circled like distant ships in fog ever since the war's end. What obligation does a military commander carry toward the very people he has been ordered to destroy? Where does duty to one's own crew end and the broader duty to humanity begin? The Laconia Order itself, when read on the page in the cold light of hindsight, seems to contain a paradox that perhaps Dönitz himself understood but could not openly acknowledge. The order forbade U-boat crews from conducting rescue operations, yes, but it framed this prohibition around a single justification: that such efforts would expose the submarines to counterattack and thus cost the lives of German sailors. In other words, the order was presented not as a moral instruction to be indifferent to suffering, but as a tactical necessity born from a specific moment of vulnerability. And that distinction, though subtle, matters enormously to how we interpret what followed. Consider for a moment the position of a U-boat captain in those months after September 1942. He had witnessed, perhaps through intelligence reports or the scattered accounts of returning crews, what happened when the Laconia sent out her open radio distress. He knew that a humanitarian gesture, undertaken in good faith, could be turned against him. The ocean, which had seemed like a realm unto itself, governed by the unwritten codes of seafaring nations, had become something else entirely, a contested zone where mercy itself could be weaponized. This was not invented by Dönitz. This was the bitter lesson that Hartenstein's unexpected compassion had taught to the entire German Navy. And yet, the broader truth is more intricate still, because even as Dönitz issued his command from Berlin, even as U-boat captains received the order and filed it away, the actual behavior of German submariners in the depths remained more varied than the official doctrine suggested. There are documented instances, fragmentary, quiet, often buried in the testimonies of survivors rather than in official records, of U-boats surfacing, of provisions being passed to lifeboats, of deliberate navigation around clusters of survivors. The human impulse to aid the drowning, it seems, could not be entirely erased by a commander's pen, even when that commander was the formidable Karl Dönitz. Some captains obeyed the letter of the order, others seemed to find ways to interpret it generously, or simply to look away. This is perhaps what makes the ethical landscape of submarine warfare so enduringly difficult to navigate. It was not a realm of obvious villains and heroes, but rather of constrained choices and competing loyalties. A U-boat captain who rescued survivors might be putting his entire crew at mortal risk. That was not propaganda, it was materially true, and yet a captain who passed by the drowning, who followed orders to the letter, returned to port, knowing he had chosen efficiency over conscience. Both men were bound by circumstances neither had created. Both faced a form of moral captivity, though the conditions were vastly different. The international law of the sea, as it had evolved through the 19th and early 20th centuries, had attempted to carve out a special moral space for maritime commerce and maritime disaster. The idea was that shipwreck was tragedy enough, without compounding it with indifference. Rescue operations were supposed to be protected, or at least tolerated, as part of a shared understanding that the ocean's dangers spared no nation. The Geneva Convention, the Hague Conventions, the rules of naval warfare, as formulated by strategists and jurists, all of these tried to create a thin but resilient thread of humanity running through the machinery of war at sea. What the Laconia incident revealed was how fragile that thread actually was. It took only one crisis, one moment of perceived vulnerability, to snap it. And once it had snapped, once a rescue operation could be turned into an ambush, the entire ethical framework seemed to collapse. Dönitz faced what many military commanders face when their forces are being systematically destroyed: the temptation to embrace ruthlessness, not as an end in itself, but as a means to survival. If U-boats would be hunted and sunk by aircraft anyway, why restrain them? Why ask them to slow their pace, to surface, to make themselves vulnerable, all in service of a humanitarian ideal that Allied forces seemed willing to exploit? This is not to excuse the Laconia Order. It is rather to trace its genealogy honestly, to understand that it did not emerge from abstract evil, but from the brutalizing logic of attrition warfare. When your ships are being sent to the bottom, month after month, year after year, the seduction of ruthlessness becomes almost irresistible. It offers the illusion of control, the sense that at least you are doing something, that you are hardening yourself and your men for survival, rather than allowing sentiment to weaken your hand. And yet the cost of that hardening extends far beyond the immediate tactical calculus. Every order that forbids compassion, that instructs men to turn away from drowning sailors, exacts a spiritual price. It corrodes something fundamental in those who give it and those who obey it. The submarine crews who received the Laconia Order were not monsters. They were young men, many of them skilled professionals, ordinary in their capacity for both cruelty and kindness. The order asked them to suppress one of those capacities and lean entirely into the other. That kind of suppression does not leave a person unchanged. In the archive of human testimony from the U-boat service, there are enough hints and fragments to suggest that some men struggled with this. Not all, certainly. War has a way of numbing moral sensation. But some captains seem to have carried the weight of restraint throughout their service, right up until the war's end. They followed the order. They did not rescue survivors. But the doing of it, the repeated choice to pass by suffering, marked them. When we read their post-war accounts, there is sometimes a quality of deflection, of self-justification, that suggests they were arguing not just with history, but with some inner witness they could not quite silence. This is what makes the ethics of wartime command so philosophically murky. We want to believe that our leaders will hold the line, will refuse to descend into pure calculation, and yet we also understand that military leadership exists in a realm where abstract principles collide constantly with the immediate needs of one's own people. A commander who sends his men on suicide missions because he fears attacking survivors will look weak to his superiors, may lose the authority necessary to make other, different decisions. The political economy of command is real and constraining. It is not an excuse, but it is an explanation that a thoughtful observer cannot dismiss. The deeper reflection, perhaps, is that the Laconia incident and the order that followed it demonstrate something troubling about the nature of modern warfare itself. As long as rescue operations remain a legitimate military target, as long as the attempt to save lives can be weaponized, the whole ethical framework of the sea begins to collapse. There is no way to be a commander and to maintain both tactical advantage and moral restraint if your opponents are willing to exploit compassion. You must choose, and whatever you choose, someone pays the price. In the decades since, international humanitarian law has tried again to build firmer walls around the protection of rescue operations. The Geneva Conventions, refined and extended in the post-war years, have made it explicit that rescue personnel and rescue vessels should be immune from attack. It is an acknowledgement that the Laconia experience had revealed a flaw in the previous system, and that without explicit protection, mercy would always be vulnerable to exploitation. Whether these protections have held in practice is, of course, another question entirely. But the attempt itself is significant. It represents a collective commitment, however imperfectly realized, to prevent another Laconia Order from emerging unchallenged from the logic of war. The ocean, in the end, offers a strange kind of mirror for human nature. It is vast and impersonal, and utterly indifferent to our moral struggles. And yet, it is also the stage on which some of our deepest questions about duty and compassion, about the limits of command and the resilience of conscience, have played out in unforgettable ways. The Laconia sank. Hartenstein tried to save those he could. Dönitz issued an order. Captains obeyed or resisted, or found ways to do both at once. And all of it, happened on an ocean that continued to move, indifferent to the weight of what transpired on its surface. The courtrooms fell silent, the verdicts were read, and the war's legal architecture began its slow crumbling into history. Yet the Laconia Order, that single, fateful document, did not disappear into the files of the Nuremberg archive. Instead, it began to haunt something far deeper, the very bones of international maritime law itself. For in the years after 1945, naval officers, legal scholars, and statesmen found themselves circling back, again and again, to the question that Dönitz's order had forced into the open. What, exactly, was a commander's duty when the sea itself became the witness to suffering? The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS as it came to be known, had existed long before the war, its origins stretching back to the Titanic disaster of 1912, when the world first truly grasped the fragility of those who ventured onto deep water. But SOLAS had been vague on certain crucial points. It spoke of the duty to render assistance, yes, but in war, in the fog of combat. The Laconia Order had exposed this ambiguity with surgical precision. Here was a military command, issued by a state at war, explicitly forbidding the very rescue that peacetime law assumed was fundamental. The contradiction could not be ignored. It had to be resolved. Throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s, a quiet revolution was taking place in the halls of the International Maritime Organization and in the deliberations of naval powers, still grappling with their own wartime conduct. The Laconia incident became, in a sense, the ghost in every conversation about the law of the sea. Officers and jurists would reference it obliquely, sometimes without even naming it directly, that U-boat rescue that went wrong, that bombing that changed everything. It represented a kind of limit case, a moment where the machinery of total war had collided with the basic human instinct to save a drowning person, and the results had been so morally corrosive that the international community could not simply move past it. One crucial evolution came in the form of Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, formalized in 1977, though the discussions that shaped it had begun decades earlier in the shadow of Nuremberg. This protocol contained explicit language protecting those attempting to rescue the wounded or shipwrecked. It forbade attacking medical personnel, hospital ships, and those engaged in rescue operations, even in warfare. The words were clear, almost accusatory in their precision. Combatants must not attack vessels or aircraft engaged in rescue operations. The echo of the Liberators' bombs was written into the covenant itself. Here was international law, slowly and painfully, codifying the lesson that Hartenstein had learned too late, that rescue, even in war, held a status that demanded protection. But what made this legal evolution so significant, and perhaps so cautious, was the debate that still swirled around Dönitz's order itself. Even after the trial, even after the convictions, there remained jurisprudential disagreement about what the order actually commanded. Some scholars pointed to its language. Rescue contradicts the most basic demands of warfare, and argued that Dönitz was not ordering outright murder, but rather a cold calculation of military efficiency. Submarines could not afford to be encumbered with survivors, therefore, they must proceed without rescue attempts. It was ruthlessness masquerading as doctrine. Others read darker intent into those same words. The order, they argued, crossed the line from stern military policy into criminality precisely because it removed the discretion that even wartime commanders possessed. Even in total war, even in the desperate Battle of the Atlantic, there remained an expectation that individual conscience might occasionally override orders. The Laconia Order attempted to eliminate that space entirely. This legal ambiguity, rather than being resolved by Dönitz's conviction, actually became part of maritime law's permanent architecture. Subsequent naval conventions and protocols built in protections precisely because they had to account for the possibility that commanders might issue ruthless orders. The law began to assume not the best of human nature, but rather a realistic assessment of what pressures military necessity could exert on moral judgment. In other words, the law evolved to protect against another Laconia Order ever being issued with legal effect. The United States Navy, in particular, undertook a rigorous re-examination of its own conduct during the war, and the Laconia incident featured prominently in that reckoning. The bombing of the rescue convoy had been, by all technical accounts, a justified military action. The B-24 crew had spotted what they believed to be enemy vessels engaged in military operations. The U-boats were, after all, submarines of a belligerent power. But the moral residue of that decision, the survivors scattered once more into the cold Atlantic, the death of those who might have been saved, left a mark on naval thinking. American commanders and naval theorists began to develop what might be called a doctrine of restrained power, the recognition that possessing the capability to destroy did not always justify its exercise, and that rescue operations, even those involving enemy vessels, held a different moral category than pure combat. What emerged, gradually and unevenly, was a new understanding embedded in the law of the sea. Maritime law began to draw a distinction, a crucial one, between combatant vessels and those engaged in rescue or medical operations. A hospital ship, a lifeboat, a rescue vessel, even one flying the flag of an enemy nation, entered a different legal and moral space. They became, in a sense, sanctuaries from the ruthlessness of warfare. This was not naivete. It was born from the hard lessons of the Laconia, from the understanding that the ocean demanded a different calculus than land warfare. A person in the water is vulnerable in a way that a soldier behind a line is not. The sea itself, cold and indifferent, becomes a kind of co-combatant. And in that reality, the law began to say, there must be some recourse to mercy, or the entire enterprise of human civilization at sea becomes merely the choreography of drowning. Interestingly, the post-war legal evolution also affected how submarine warfare itself was conceived and constrained. The Geneva Convention's protocol included strict language about unrestricted submarine warfare, a direct response to the very tactics that had defined the U-boat campaign of 1939 to 1945. Submarines must surface and identify merchant vessels before attacking them, giving crews time to abandon ship. It is a rule that seems almost quaint in the age of guided missiles and automated targeting, yet it exists precisely because the international community decided, after witnessing the Laconia and the countless other merchant ships sunk with their crews, that the ocean demanded better of those who commanded upon it. The Laconia Order itself, paradoxically, became a kind of pedagogical tool in post-war military academies and naval colleges. It was cited not as an example of valid military doctrine, but rather as a cautionary tale about the corrosive effect of ruthlessness on both individual conscience and institutional honor. Officers studied it to understand how necessity, taken to its logical extreme, could become corrupting. The order demonstrated that when military efficiency was elevated above all other considerations, when winning became the sole calculus, the military institution itself began to lose something essential. Dönitz's U-boat arm had been devastatingly effective, yes, but at the cost of a kind of moral compromising that, in the end, could not be defended even by those who had carried it out. The International Committee of the Red Cross, which had observed the war's maritime campaigns with growing horror, incorporated lessons from the Laconia into its post-war advocacy and humanitarian law development. The ICA understood, in ways that perhaps pure military theorists sometimes missed, that the boundaries between permissible and impermissible conduct had to be written down, had to be made explicit, or they would erode with each new pressure of circumstances. The Laconia Order represented a moment where erosion had accelerated into collapse. The international community responded by attempting to build more durable walls, by making the law more specific, more protective of those most vulnerable. Yet even as these legal frameworks solidified, a deeper question lingered in the minds of those who studied these matters. Can law ever truly capture the moral reality of a moment like Hartenstein's decision to surface and begin rescuing survivors? Can codification encompass the courage it took for him to disobey, in effect, the emerging doctrine of his own command? The legal structures that developed after the Laconia were necessary, yes. They were part of how the international community attempted to stitch together a more humane set of boundaries around warfare. But they could not, in themselves, create the conscience that led a submarine captain to risk his vessel and crew to save the drowning. That remained, as it perhaps always must, a matter of individual choice, of personal courage, in the face of systemic pressure. The echoes of the Laconia continued to reverberate through naval law in ways both obvious and subtle. When new treaties were negotiated, when admirals drafted new protocols, when officers were trained in the conduct of warfare at sea, the incident stood in the background like an ancestral witness. It whispered the warning that efficiency without ethics becomes atrocity, that military command carries within it the burden of moral choice, and that the ocean, vast and indifferent though it may be, does not exempt those who venture upon it from the basic claims of humanity. The Atlantic, in the decades that followed, kept its secrets well. The waters that held the Laconia and the men who sank with her, the rescuers and the rescued, the bombers and the hunted, all of it settled beneath the swells and the years until it became something less like history and more like a kind of collective half-remembered dream. But the ocean, it seems, does not truly forget. It holds impressions, traces, echoes that surface in the minds of those who study it, who try to understand what it means when mercy and violence collide so starkly in the darkness. The story of that September night, and all that followed from Dönitz's cold decree, did not end when the war ended. It transformed. It became a question mark, suspended in the consciousness of maritime law, in the training of naval officers, in the very structure of how nations now govern the conduct of war at sea. What had begun as a moral choice made in desperation by a single captain, Hartenstein's decision to surface, to risk everything for strangers, had become, by the war's end, a forbidden act. And then, in the aftermath, it became something else entirely. It became a lesson, a warning written in salt water and sorrow. Consider how silence works. After great events, after terrible things have been done and witnessed, there is often a silence that settles, not the absence of sound, but something deeper, a kind of restraint, a reluctance to speak carelessly about what cannot be easily categorized as right or wrong. The Laconia Order represented such a silence. It was an order given, yes, written down and distributed, but it was also a silence imposed, a silencing. U-boat captains were told, in effect, to ignore the cries of the drowning, to hear them, perhaps, through the steel hull of their vessel, and to turn away, to remain silent, to keep moving. And yet, historians have puzzled over those exact words for 3/4 of a century. The order itself, when examined closely, contains an ambiguity that may or may not have been intentional. It forbade U-boats from picking up survivors, from towing lifeboats, from providing supplies or assistance. It was framed as a safety measure, a necessary hardening born from the bombing that had followed Hartenstein's mercy. But was it, truly? Or was it something more calculated, a formalization of ruthlessness? The language allows both interpretations to exist simultaneously, like two possible paths diverging in fog, and perhaps that very ambiguity tells us something about how power operates, how orders can be given that allow room for denial, for the claim that one was merely obeying, merely following procedure, nothing more. The men who served in the U-boats, after the order was issued, carried with them a peculiar burden. Those who had been trained to see themselves as honorable sailors, as inheritors of a naval tradition stretching back centuries, were now being asked to behave in ways that contradicted that self-image. Some rationalized it. The enemy, after all, showed no mercy. The bombing of the Laconia's rescue operation had proven that. But others felt the weight of it differently. They continued to rescue survivors when they could, quietly, perhaps closing their eyes to what the order explicitly forbade. How does one quietly disobey a direct command while still commanding respect from one's crew? How does one live with both choices, the choice to obey and the choice to subtly resist? These questions hang in the air like the salt spray that never truly leaves the skin of a sailor who has been at sea. And they matter, perhaps, because they help us understand something fundamental about how ordinary people navigate extraordinary circumstances. We tend to imagine that during wartime, especially during so dark a conflict as the Second World War, individuals had clear choices before them. But the reality was often far more blurred, more complicated, more compromised. A U-boat captain could obey the Laconia Order and still believe himself to be a decent man. He could tell himself that survival demanded hardness, that sentiment had no place in warfare, that the enemy had already proven they would not afford him or his crew mercy. And there may have been truth in all of that, but there was also evasion, also denial. also the slow erosion of the line between what one is forced to do and what one chooses to become. The post-war trials, particularly Nuremberg, brought these contradictions into sharp relief. Dönitz was prosecuted, but the prosecution of his order proved difficult in ways that still resonate through international maritime law. How culpable was an admiral for an order that, on its surface, could be defended as a military necessity? The order never explicitly commanded U-boats to attack lifeboats, after all. It merely forbade rescue. There is a difference, the lawyers argued, between forbidding aid and commanding harm. And yet there is also something chilling in the distinction. If a drowning man calls out to you and you turn away, are you less guilty than if you had pushed him under? The ocean itself offers no judgment. It simply receives. It receives the bodies and the wreckage and the weight of decisions made far away in concrete bunkers and the metal tubes of submarines. The water does not distinguish between the innocent and the guilty. It takes them all with the same indifference. And perhaps that is part of what makes the sea such a complicated mirror for human conflict. We project our morality onto it, but it remains unchanged. It remains silent. It continues its ancient work of erosion and dissolution, wearing down stone and bone, and the memory of even the most consequential events. Yet, from that very silence, something has emerged. Over the decades following the war, maritime law has evolved. The conventions governing the conduct of naval warfare have become more specific, more humane, in their attempts to protect civilians and to ensure that certain basic decencies are observed even amid the chaos of conflict. The Laconia incident, rather than being forgotten, has become a kind of reference point. When admirals train their officers, when international bodies convene to discuss the rules of engagement at sea, the Laconia Order casts its long shadow, not as a precedent to be followed, but as a warning, as evidence of what can happen when compassion is systematically removed from military doctrine. The story of the Laconia teaches something quieter and more personal as well. It reminds us that the people caught in historical events are not mere symbols or casualties. Hartenstein was not simply an embodiment of German militarism. He was a man who made a choice in a moment of crisis. His choice to surface, to risk his vessel and his crew to save drowning strangers, emerged from somewhere in his character that had nothing to do with the order he later received. And that choice, preserved in the historical record, preserved in the memories of survivors and the testimonies collected after the war, stands as a kind of counterpoint to Dönitz's order. It suggests that even within systems designed to extinguish individual conscience, even under the pressure of military hierarchy and the demands of total war, there remained the possibility of choosing differently. The men and women who survived the Laconia, those who were pulled from the water by Hartenstein's crew or rescued by the Vichy French ships that arrived later, those who made it back to land and spent the rest of their lives carrying the memory of that night, they too became witnesses. They became keepers of a story that would not fit neatly into any official narrative. Not a story of German heroism, certainly, but also not a story of German villainy untouched by humanity. A more complicated story, a story in shades of grey, which may be why it has proven so difficult to tell and so crucial to preserve. What does the ocean remember? We speak of memory as if it were a capacity unique to conscious beings, but the ocean has its own form of memory. It remembers the vibrations of the U-boats that hunted beneath its surface. It remembers the shock waves of the bombs that fell from the sky. It remembers the voices of the drowning, the prayers, the calls for help that went unanswered. And it remembers, too, the moment when a submarine surfaced in the darkness, and its crew made a choice to see the humanity in strangers. That memory is preserved not in any archive or memorial, but in the changed understanding of those who came after, in the slow evolution of how we govern warfare, in the quiet moral calculations that each generation makes as it inherits the lessons of the past. As you drift now, carried on the current of this story, as one might be carried on the swell of a vast and patient sea, consider what it means to